Good morning. We're going to begin. My name is Michael Cohen. I'm a professor at the New School University in New York, and it's my great pleasure to have the opportunity to chair this important dialogue on innovative financing mechanisms for local authorities, and to be joined by a very distinguished set of colleagues here on the panel from various countries with lots of experience and interesting ideas to share with everyone this morning. We're going to start off this event, before we get into introducing people and into the substance of the event. We're going to show a brief video to get everybody sort of in the same framework, and then we will start the panel.
The world is fast urbanizing. Today, more than half of humanity lives in urban areas. Cities present unparalleled opportunities for creating wealth and prosperity. Most of the world's economic output is now generated in cities. Cities account for 55% of the GDP in low-income countries, 73% in middle-income countries, and 85% in high-income countries. Rapid urbanization that we are experiencing today brings about immense positive benefits. But if cities are to play this role, they need to be properly planned, financed, and governed. If not, they can become the centers of despair, poverty, and violence. Rapidly growing urban poverty cannot be successfully tackled without addressing the basic needs of the billions of urban poor. These needs include access to adequate housing, clean drinking water, sanitation, domestic energy, and transport. A serious challenge urban authorities in developing countries are facing is their inability to mobilize adequate financial resources for urban development. Urban authorities are seriously under-resourced and therefore unable to meet the ever-growing demand for infrastructures and services. To effectively address this challenge, urban authorities should exploit the full potential of generating revenue from local sources. In addition, urban authorities should also implement innovative mechanisms for generating additional revenue. Land-based financing strategies such as land readjustment and land value sharing are innovative ways to generate additional municipal revenue. Colombia, for example, has used land value sharing tools since 1921. Cities of Bogota, Cali, and Medellin generate over 25% of their revenue using this tool. Public-private partnerships, municipal development funds, municipal development corporations, and borrowing from the capital markets by issuing municipal bonds are other ways through which urban authorities can generate additional financial resources. Cities should introduce appropriate legislation and regulations to implement these urban financing strategies.
Very good. Thank you. This morning, we're going to talk about a very important subject which relates to the broad substantive theme of this World Urban Forum, which is how do we finance the inclusion and the social equity that we think is so important in the pattern of urban development. Too often, there are objectives for social equity without the technical basis for determining how we achieve these objectives. And we're very fortunate today to have a panel with some very interesting experience which will be presented and discussed. Given the range of global experience, and thinking about the format, this will be more of a conversation than a series of presentations one after the other. And so we're hoping that there will be lots of interaction, and at a certain moment in the morning, we will open it up for questions and comments from the floor. So we hope as you hear these presentations and comments, you'll think about your own questions. And we'll be happy to hear your perspective on these issues. Let me briefly introduce the panel. in the program there are the full biographies. To my immediate left is Mayor Ben Abelos Jr. from the city of Mandaluyong in Metro Manila in the Philippines. And we're very pleased to have the mayor here this morning because his city is known as the Tiger of the Philippines. It's a city which has been successful in using economic development strategies and political strategies to achieve social and economic objectives. So we're looking forward, Mr. Mayor, to hearing your observations. To his left is Matthew Glasser from the World Bank, who's a senior urban specialist who works on legal issues and municipal finance. And he's had extensive experience in different parts of the world, including in South Africa. To his left is Ibrahim Muhanna from Lebanon, who created a rating agency which evaluates the capacity of local municipalities to borrow in the capital markets. And this is very, very interesting because I think the whole question of whether local governments have access to financial markets is something that's always in the air and never concrete enough. And so he has wide experience on this question. To his left is Larry Walters from Brigham Young University in the United States, also with long experience on land-based financing mechanisms and revenue, and real municipal finance specialist. We're delighted you're here. And to his left is Alfredo Garay from Buenos Aires, who has worked in the city government in the province and currently is on the directing board of the Puerto Madero Development Corporation, who has lots of experience in this region. And I'm particularly interested in his observations about how different sized cities have different financial opportunities and possibilities. I think too often in this discussion about local finance, there's an assumption that all cities are equal. And they really are not. They really have very different needs and capacities. And so I'm looking forward to his comments. And I'm particularly pleased that our last member of the panel, Paula Andrea Tamayo, who's the Secretary of Gender from the municipality of Medellin, is able to join us. We had originally in this panel, Nadine Yameyego from the African Development Bank was supposed to be here, and she had to decline at the last minute, so we're very happy that you could join us. And we hope that as the conversation proceeds, particularly on questions of equity and what all this financial work means, that you'll be able to comment, and so we look forward to your interventions as well. I'd like to thank Habitat for this invitation and for putting the panel together, and I would like to make a few introductory remarks which tries to locate this question of local finance within the broader question of equity. This morning we're going to talk about revenue, how revenue can be mobilized to support social objectives and economic objectives. We're going to talk about expenditures, how money is actually used, and probably most importantly, we're going to talk about the impact of spending on cities and whether that impact actually improves equity or whether it doesn't, and how spending can be used to achieve some of these objectives. We know that good country policies, economic development policies and tax policies are necessary, but they're not a sufficient condition to generate productive cities and resources at the local level. Too often many of the resources are kept at the national level, and it's difficult for local authorities to actually receive the revenue that they need for their work. But we also know that even when local authorities have resources, that's also not enough, because they need to have strong institutions, they need to have strong leadership, and they also need to be aware of the particular conditions of their city, whether there's high density in land use, whether there's active industrial activity going on, whether there's an important informal sector who may be difficult to tax and to register. So local finance is not just a technical financial question. It's part of the broader panoply of our understanding of the city And clearly, without resources, we can't expect development in the direction that we would hope. A number of years ago, I had the opportunity to work in Buenos Aires, and I did an analysis of expenditure in the 90s. And what I discovered was that 67% of all public expenditure by the municipality went to 11% of the people over a decade. Now, at that time, in the 90s, in Latin America, many people said that inequality was a result of national policy, or policies that were at the global level. But in fact, in the Buenos Aires case, inequality was partly a local product. It was a result of the spending patterns. And I remember saying to the mayor that this inequality shows that there are 5 cities of Buenos Aires, and where you live depends on the level of welfare that you have. In other cities, I live in New York now. In New York, we have the same problem. There are parts of the city which receive excellent finance, excellent support, good maintenance of infrastructure, but there are many inequalities. Professor Joseph Stiglitz spoke here a few nights ago, and he speaks also about inequality. And one of the interesting things in New York is how there is such a big concentration in one place versus the other. And you know that in your own cities. This is not a unique problem to one part of the world or another. It's a shared problem. And that's why it's so important. We know from the academic literature and from the work of the international organizations, particularly the OECD, that there is a very strong relationship between local expenditures and the level of welfare and growth in a particular place, in a particular country. So countries where there has been a lot of local expenditure to support social objectives, they tend to have higher incomes. So this is not just a local question, it's a national question. And I think it's important to make those connections. As I've walked around the forum here, I've heard many conversations by people from the NGO community and from the universities and local governments. It's an exciting environment. And yet I also have a sense that there's expectation that the problem of inequity and equity itself can be improved, and that we really need to work on it. But I also have a sense of unreality in some of the discussions, because the question is, where's the money, where are the instruments, where are the policies that can actually be achieved? So today we're going to get into some of those details in a very kind of practical way. I think one important message which I would like you to reflect on as we go ahead here is that one size doesn't fit all. That each country has its own institutional histories and political histories. There's great diversity among our cities, and yet we all have this common problem of how do we mobilize resources for social objectives. And so it's sort of within that framework that I'd like to begin. We're going to have 3 rounds of questions, and the first question is we're going to start on the revenue side, and I'd like to ask the Mayor Avalos from the Philippines. Mr. Mayor, we know that the policies that you followed in your city has produced really excellent results. Can you tell us about the story and how you've managed to use these resources to advance these objectives?
Thank you so much, Mike, and good morning to everyone. For me, revenue is the barometer of the confidence of investors in one city. Revenue is the symbol of how great a city is in terms of management. Low revenue means no projects to finance social projects and other projects. So poor revenue simply means mismanagement. So that is really, for me, what revenue is all about. It's the lifeblood of every local government unit. And so we need to increase revenue. However, there are several factors that we must understand. Number one, people are always apprehensive to change. Any change at all, it's the nature of every people to just stay with the status quo. Number two, as what Mike said, we have to study different cultures. We have different political systems. In democracies, it will be harder to implement harsh changes because there will be lawsuits, protests, etc. And one thing that we must consider is the term of office of a mayor. The term of office of an executive. If he's going to do a project which is very controversial, he might lose the next election. So these are just things that must be kept in mind during these discussions. My city before was one of the poorest cities in Metro Manila. It is the smallest city. And during those times, my city was known as a joke town because it used to house the mental hospital. It's small. So we thought of a way, innovation, a project that is doable. Doable, that's the thing. And it is realistic. Short term, long term. So we had our SWOT analysis, our strength, our weakness. Our weaknesses were small. Our roads are small, but our strength is our location. We're in the heart of Metro Manila. And of course, our people. That's our biggest strength. So how did we attract revenues? Number one, we showed investors that there should be transparency as far as procedures are concerned. Not only transparency, but of course, there should be removal of red tape. You must show that there is no corruption. Aside from doing the fundamental things like garbage, traffic, these are very fundamental for any mayors. But when it comes to revenue, you must show the environment that you must lessen red tape. During my time, I used to be the president of all mayors of the Philippines. I used to be the president of all executives, from governors, vice governors, down the line to the barangay captain. So we had a plan, and I worked with IFC before. Why not look at the number one source of revenue, which is business taxes? Every year, we renew our taxes. In the Philippines, just for renewal, it will take 3 days or 27 steps. So what we did, we made a pilot study from 3 days to just 15 minutes, from 27 steps to just 4 steps. My city, together with 3 cities, did this as a pilot. And you know what? From 12 billion investments in less than a year or less than 2 years, my investments in my city rose to about 120 billion. So as long as you show transparency, cutting on red tape, you will have a lot of confidence. And aside from this, later I will be discussing some innovative projects, but paramount is, of course, financial institutions. And, of course, raising confidence. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Alfredo Garay to... how does this show up in Latin America and in Argentina specifically? What's your view of success there?
Hola. Ahora. Yo creo que es interesante empezar este razonamiento tratando de comprender la racionalidad, digamos, subyacente de la que habló recién Michael. Nosotros venimos observando cómo a nivel general el capital financiero viene tomando la hegemonía del proceso productivo. Y en este sentido también identificar cómo esta búsqueda, digamos, de una renta extraordinaria como respuesta a la caída tendencial de la tasa de ganancias, sobre todo en los países centrales, bueno, hace que el capital patrulle el mundo buscando áreas de oportunidad. Si nosotros miramos, por ejemplo, la transformación de la industria de la construcción en nuestros países, bueno, observamos que ha habido una transformación que ha desplazado a las empresas constructoras con la presencia de figuras como developers y grandes desarrolladores urbanos que intervienen, digamos, sobre la realidad en gran escala. Esta particularidad, bueno, ha también cambiado el tipo de producto, el tipo de intervención. Digamos, podemos decir que de alguna manera formatea el tipo de resultado que tenemos sobre la ciudad desde justamente estas nuevas prácticas, estas nuevas identificaciones de productos que garanticen, digamos, esta rentabilidad. Entonces, bueno, hoy en día los efectos de esta tendencia tienen que ver con el incremento del tamaño de las intervenciones, tiene que ver con el tipo de producto, tiene que ver con la aplicación de ciertas racionalidades constructivas e incluso con las características cómo se van trasladando ciertas funciones que son características del espacio público de la ciudad a recintos privados controlados justamente por estos desarrolladores. En este sentido, a mí me parece interesante vincular estas tendencias con algunas de las observaciones que hacía en la charla introductoria y en varias oportunidades el doctor Kloss, que justamente se preguntaba, es decir, cuáles son las tendencias o las ideas de los urbanistas respecto a la evolución de la ciudad. Y yo creo que no tiene tanto que ver su explicación con las ideas de los urbanistas como las ideas de la racionalidad del negocio inmobiliario, de la actividad, digamos, que subyace y de la participación, digamos, de el capital, digamos, dentro de estos negocios que subyacen. Quizá la observación más importante justamente tiene que ver con cuáles son los vehículos que vinculan el capital global, el capital financiero global, con los emprendimientos locales. Y en este sentido empezamos a encontrar todo tipo de vehículos que de alguna manera estructuran un puente entre un pequeño círculo de inversores locales, de el famoso ejemplo de un plomero de New York o de una universidad o de un grupo de vecinos, digamos, que participan de un fondo de inversión que en su cartera incluyen, digamos, bonos o títulos o acciones, digamos, de riesgo y que esas acciones de riesgo se ofrecen en general en los países de bajo salario. Bueno, esta vinculación yo creo que es muy importante para entender el tipo de transformación que se está experimentando en nuestras ciudades. De golpe vemos que esta política no solo formatea a las empresas constructoras, sino a las políticas de vivienda. Y este proceso de concentración induce sobre los estados la urbanización de grandes polígonos de construcción con un producto y un target perfectamente definido. Vemos, por ejemplo, cómo este tipo de formatos se ha multiplicado en países donde la política financiera pasó a tomar la hegemonía en la definición de las políticas de vivienda, como es el caso de Chile, Colombia y México, ¿no? Y en esto también con dos tipos de formatos: expansión de suburbios de baja densidad, como en Guatemala, El Salvador o México, o expansión de polígonos de alta densidad, como vemos, por ejemplo, en el caso de Colombia, ¿no? Es decir, esta observación, digamos, de la vinculación entre las transformaciones del capital financiero y las nuevas lógicas, las nuevas racionalidades de formateos del territorio, me parece que sirven de marco para que después empecemos a interpretar los vehículos concretos, los instrumentos concretos y sobre todo el papel del Estado, la participación del Estado. Sobre todo cuando en la década del 90 y un poco en el contexto de las políticas neoliberales nos decían que el Estado debía ser un facilitador y debía permitir, digamos, este formateo del territorio siguiendo las reglas del mercado. Y bueno, y lo que ha sido toda esta experiencia durante décadas que hoy en día llevan a las sociedades a pedir un papel más activo del Estado como garante de la equidad, como garante de la sustentabilidad del ambiente, como garante de la eficacia de la producción y, yo diría, en última instancia, en los temas realmente determinantes, del acceso al empleo y del valor del salario.
Thank you. Let me turn to Matt Glasser. Matt, what are examples of cities around the world that seem to have strong revenue performance, and how would you explain some of that?
Thanks, Mike. I think you raise a good point. I think when we talk about innovative financing tools, it's important to separate the revenue side of the equation from the leveraging side of the equation. Because a lot of times people speak about borrowing as though it's a source of revenue. And of course, it's actually a claim on future revenues. So you can never get yourself into a better situation simply by borrowing. You have to focus on the revenues. And in the time that I've been working on municipal finance in the world, I've detected a shift. We used to talk about stability, adequacy, and predictability of revenues. And I think increasingly we're now beginning to focus also on the equity side of revenues. You mentioned in your introductory remarks the importance of equity and expenditure. But the question of who you collect money from is also important. And I think that's what is behind some of the current interest in land-based financing tools. Here in Colombia, we hear about the plusvalias, which is an opportunity for the city to share in the capital appreciation that happens as a result of land use regulation, not putting in infrastructure, but just changing the rules of the game. Or the valorización, which is an infrastructure-related increase in value. And around the world, there are all sorts of land-based financing tools which are used. But I think the mayor made an interesting point too when he talked about the business taxes. As a city invests in its infrastructure, the revenues that are affected are not just specifically the property tax or the land tax, but they're the whole complex of revenues. And most cities in the world, certainly if you look at the OECD countries, they have some form of a property tax so that they get that revenue, but they almost all have some form of a business tax as well. So what you're after is a nice symbiotic relationship between the business and the municipality, because you're requiring that business community to generate jobs, you're requiring them to make money in order that you're able, to tap into that revenue. So, one country that I know well is South Africa. South Africa happens to be a country where the municipalities in the aggregate make about 85% now of their revenues from own sources. And it varies, as you said in your introductory remarks, between the big cities and the smaller and rural communities. If you look at any country in the world, the majority of the income is generated in cities, the majority of wealth is in cities, the majority of business activity takes place in cities. And these are the things that are taxed. So whether they're taxed by local government revenue tools or whether they're taxed by national government revenue tools, ultimately the money for investment in cities has to come from the cities. And so in any country, there's a question of whether the money should be provided by transfers from national government or whether it should be collected at the base level. But in a way, that's a little bit, it's just a question of technique, because still the money comes from the cities. I might talk a little later about the specifics of South Africa, but let me just say this in general. When we talk about financing local infrastructure and local services, we're really talking about two things. We often focus on the money part and the revenues. And the other thing that we're talking about is playing with these revenues over a time frame, and ideally a long time frame. So a city financing structure, financing strategy, in my view, should take account not only of the current revenues, but how those revenues are going to evolve over time, how your expenditure needs are going to evolve over time, and how those are going to be impacted depending on what you invest in. Another important reason to consider time is that any city has not only the current social investment needs to extend infrastructure to people who don't have services, and it not only has the need to invest for growth so that the economy can grow, it also has the need to be thinking about rehabilitation and reinvestment in aging infrastructure. It's a blind spot in many cities, and it's not as sexy to rehabilitate a sewer line as it is to cut a ribbon on a new bridge. But if you don't fix that old sewer line, you're setting yourself up for serious trouble.
Thank you. I think that's a very important point. One of the interesting things that I've been reading about is the fact that climate change has affected the weather conditions, which in turn affect infrastructure. So in some of the northern cities, we've had a large number of breakages and explosions of pipes because the temperatures changed. And we didn't know about that because we didn't maintain it, and it was never in the budget. So the maintenance people are always upset that they don't have enough money to do their job properly. So there's a connection between these dynamic conditions and municipal finance and expenditures. So I think it's a very interesting connection. Ibrahim, could you tell us a little bit about some of the Middle Eastern cases and what's your perspective on that?
Good morning, everybody. I think you should bring the whole thing. Actually, it's very interesting that we keep talking about revenue side. The main problem with municipalities financing is because we only talk about revenue and expenses, and we don't talk about the total picture. Matt did mention a little bit about the debt issue that is not revenue. It's correct. But the debt issue is only captured in the accounts if you do a balance sheet. And most public accounting does not look at the total financial statements of an institution such as a municipality. So you should look at the balance sheet, which will capture both the assets and the liability. And this is the only time when you look at your liabilities, especially if they are long-term, and your liability is not only borrowing, your liability sometimes are promises to your staff, your promises to any other things that unfortunately municipalities do not accrue for that. And this is to be captured when you are analyzing the financial of the institutions. Earlier yesterday when we were talking about the future of borrowings for these municipalities in the emerging markets and the accessibility of the capital market, we see that the muni bond in the US, it's reached almost $3.7 trillion, which is the largest single country jurisdiction in municipal bonds. On the other hand, South Africa, Poland, Philippines are one of the fastest growing among the emerging market in issuing muni bonds. But municipal bonds are not the only answer. And they are being pushed really by organizations like the World Bank and the IMF, because most countries, their national debt is increasing by the minute. And the ratio of the national debt to the GDP causes that countries, the cost of that borrowing become very expensive. So the answer was allow development to take place on local level and allow borrowing to take place on the local level. This way we will lessen the weight on the national governments on the borrowing, and then everybody will be more accountable to their borrowing. Here I would like to say transparency is very important, and then the lender is closer to the project, and then we can come and judge on the performance on the borrowing as well. I will be talking later on, I believe, on how credit rating is all about when it comes to borrowing, but I would like to mention that the size of municipality, we could not find any correlation between the size of a municipality and optimum management of a municipality. We found out some large municipalities, 80% of their revenue is spent on administering the municipality and only 20% on development. This is the worst case we see. And the best case we saw, municipalities that 10% of the revenue is spent on administration of the municipality and 90% on the development, urban development and all the development needed in the municipality. And that we found it, whether in small municipality and big municipality. So we were unable to find an optimum relationship. What is the best size of municipality to say it is badly or good management, managed. So again, we'll talk about later on that management is the key answer to a proper municipality, not the size of the revenue or the size of the population it manages.
Great. Thank you. I think this last point about what is the mix of responsibilities for municipalities and how revenue, whether revenue is sufficient or not, is a very critical question. If we look, for example, at some of the West African countries and West African cities, we see that there are very low levels of revenue per capita. And so it's not surprising that there's not a lot of money left over, for example, for social services. A lot is picked up through the municipal personnel, a lot is used in garbage collection and solid waste management, but then critical areas like health and education, some of these things, there's simply not money at the local level to do it, and very frequently also at the national level. So we'll come back to this question, but I appreciate Ibrahim's point about there being no optimum level, and we need to go on a case-by-case basis. I'd like to ask Larry Walters to comment on the particular role of land-based financing instruments. And given, Larry, given your experience in this field, what are some of the cases that have been successful, and what are some of that have not been successful? What do we see this? What's the downside of trying this and it not working out?
Thank you. This is a very interesting and important question, I think, because there are examples where land has been used as a revenue source quite successfully, and other examples where it has been much less successful. And part of it has to do with the issues that have been raised already about the administrative capacity of the entities involved and the division of responsibilities between different agencies and different levels of government. As been mentioned, Colombia has a particularly interesting experience with what I would characterize as betterment levies, which are the concept is that an infrastructure project is considered, and the area of land area affected by that project is identified, and the landowners in that area are then assessed a proportion of the costs with the intent of financing the improvement. In Colombia, that's been very successful. It's been in use since the 1920s. In Medellin, in particular, they have funded, I believe it's about 60% of their major road system with that technique. In some countries, such as India, it's also been successful, though the courts in India have indicated that the investment must be made first and then the cost recovered, whereas in Colombia they're able to collect the money up front and then make the investment, is my understanding. One of the other approaches that has been used successfully in some cases is what I would describe as a developer exaction. This is the case where the land developer comes to the city and says, we would like to put in a major investment. And the city says, that's great, we'll give you permission to do that. In the process, though, we want you to either give us land or cash so that we can put in the public infrastructure, the parks, the roads, the other improvements that are necessary. And because the investment has enough investment potential for the private sector, they're willing to compensate the city with those developer exactions. Again, this has been a very successful technique around the world. Medellin has a very strong program in this area right now as well. Somewhat less successful is the notion that Matt raised of capital gain sharing, where the public entity allows a change in land use or an increase in density, and as a result, private land values increase quite substantially, and the government attempts to share in some of that increase. Frankly, this has not been an approach that has been very successful around the world. The UK has been trying to do that for over 100 years, and every attempt has been abandoned within a 3 or 4 year period. The most recent efforts in the UK have focused more on recovering costs, which is that first notion that I mentioned, rather than in actually sharing in the value increase. Colombia has a law in place now that explicitly requires local governments to capture 30 to 50% of that value increase. Its revenue generating results have not been very satisfactory. It's generated much less revenue than was originally anticipated. And in fact, in many jurisdictions, including Medellin, the law was passed in 1998, if I remember correctly. They're just, in 2013, adopted the local legislation required to implement it, and I believe they have yet to see any money from that source. And the reason is really pretty straightforward, I think. It's a politically extremely difficult thing to do. We grant a permission to a local government, to a private entity, to change its land use or increase the development density. The land value clearly goes up quite dramatically. And the question is whether or not you can expect that the developer to share those gains in a one-time charge as the development is taking place, which is the approach that has generally been taken. And there's generally significant political resistance to doing that. It would seem to me to be a much more successful and politically palatable approach to be a little more patient and to take those gains over a longer period of time, and I'll have more to say about that. There are other approaches that are used around the world, and I suppose that they can be categorized, and some of them have to do with the charges associated with access to public land. This would include ground rents, land leasing, franchise fees, which are fees that are charged to private companies for the use of public right-of-ways like roads. And those are widely used. My sense, though, is that one of the reasons that they are used is the rates are too low, much too low to generate much money. On the value sharing side, there are, again, these two categories. One approach looks at cost recovery. Can we recover the cost for a specific investment? And there we look at the betterment charges or the developer exactions. The other approach says, raises the question, can we share in the gains in private land values that result from public actions, whether it be infrastructure investment or in changes in land use. Countries that have an effective income tax system often do that through what's known as a capital gains tax, but that tends to be part of the income tax system and is not generally available to local governments. Another approach that is getting increasing attention was used in Sao Paulo and other parts of Brazil, which is to create tradable development rights, where the government identifies the amount of additional development that they are willing to permit in a larger area, and then actually sells those development rights at auction. And developers who wish to develop their land buy those development rights and are then permitted to use them. Another approach in this is if the government is successful in their investment strategy at increasing the value of publicly held land, then that publicly held land can be sold and the gains captured. But if we're not increasing the value of the public land, simply transferring a tangible real estate or land or property asset into a cash asset doesn't seem to me to qualify as gain sharing or value capture. There first has to be something that changes the value, that increases the value. Finally, I think there's tremendous potential in the annual property tax, which is used by a number of countries, as was noted, but frankly, in most developing countries, it's seriously underutilized. And there are a number of administrative reasons for that, but there are also some political reasons for that as well. So I'm sure we'll have more to say about that.
Thank you. I think that this last question about land-based financing instruments is particularly important. And I'd like to put those in the context of Dr. Close's remarks on a number of occasions about our need to think about, for example, city extensions and to think about changing the density of cities, increasing density, and thinking about urban form as one part of our strategy of absorbing more people and allowing them to be more productive, but to do this in an equitable way. And so the question of, if you're going to change the physical form, the physical spaces in the city, what are the what opportunities does that process provide to make financial changes and tax changes so that we can somehow use those changes itself to generate new revenue? And I think too often the local finance discussion has been rather static. There are these kind of taxes. We've heard about property taxes for a long time. But if at the same time we're going to change the physical form, I think it would be a serious mistake not to match that with some change in the whole tax structure and the way in which we finance those changes themselves. So with sort of this in mind, I'd like to ask the mayor, as the leader of a city which has been very dynamic and in fact changing, how does this play out in your city? What kind of things do you try to do?
Thank you so much, Mike. Mr. Waters and Mr. Lawrence really gave us a number of type of financing that we could have on land-based. What I could share with you is an actual project of our city in the 1990s. Can I ask the Secretariat to show slide number 11, please? Slide number 11. No, 11. Sorry. Okay, 11. No, before that. 11. Before that. Okay. That is our old public market. It got burned down. And in our country, it's always, a public market is always subsidized by government. When it was burned down, we have the option of, at that time, constructing a new one, which will cost us at least 100 million. So it will be very expensive. At that time, there was an economic crisis, so we tried to find a way. That piece of property is very valuable to our area. It's very strategic. So what we did, we tried to find some developers who will develop the area. And our idea will be to build in that area, instead of a market, a huge mall. And inside the mall will be a public market. So instead of us building a market which will have to pay 10 million every year to finance, we did the opposite. We asked the private partners to build a mall for us. They will not pay us for the next 40 years as an incentive for realty taxes, on the condition that the public market will be given to the city for free. So they could make use of the property for 40 years. However, after 40 years, the whole structure will be given to the city. It's called Build, Operate, and Transfer, the first BOT program in the Philippines, in our country. After 2 years, this is the new market. Next slide, please. Next slide. This is the new mall. So inside that mall is a public market. So through this kind of financing, our city did not spend a single centavo. In fact, right now we're earning 10 million or 20 million every year just from business taxes alone. This is one case of what Mr. Matters said a while ago. Thank you.
Great. So this is sort of thinking innovatively. I remember at one of these Habitat meetings many years ago, I heard the former mayor of Curitiba, Jaime Lerner, say, you never solve one problem at a time. Try to solve two and try to make these connections. And I think part of the issue is how we link these things. And this is an interesting example. I'd like to come back to Ibrahim to connect this up with the capital markets. And the mayor had mentioned bringing private investors into the process. But we all know that private investors, they have objectives. They want to earn some money on their investments. They have demands very frequently on local governments. It's not like they're coming necessarily benevolently to just do things to help the public. So how do you think about this concern of private capital in the context of a municipality? And what are the conditions in a municipality that you think are necessary? And I know you've been involved in this whole question of ratings. Maybe you could explain the rating process to us. Because for the mayor to have received this money, the private investors must have had confidence in his administration. So I'd be interested in your take on this.
Actually, most municipalities that we have looked at, they were living on donations. So either donations from donors or handouts from the government, from the central government down. So both are really, the decision is from the donor. He have an agenda, usually when the donor gives the money or when the government has the money down. But when you are borrowing from the commercial market, usually you have your agenda. You decide on the project and you have to sell it to a lender. The only way you can do that is when you understand the finances of your operation. You have to show the lender that you can repay. So we have seen that most mayors, no matter why they are university graduates or not, they all have wishful thinking. They all have good at heart. They want to serve their community. But none of them, or most of them, don't have a municipal education. Or whether they are doctors or lawyers or engineers, they run for an office and they become mayors. But almost none of them have went to a course or a school to understand municipal finance. So they depend very much on their advisors on this issue. And usually advisors become like the donors. They have also their agendas. So the most important things in credit rating, we don't only rate the financial strength of a municipality, looking at their revenues, their expenses, and trying to assess whether they have even registered for their assets. Like Larry mentioned earlier, how can you tax a capital gain tax if you initially don't capture the initial valuation of that property? So if you book the initial valuation, fair value of the property, and then if you sell it or you reevaluate it, then you can say some kind of capital tax on that as well, capital gain tax on it. So it is very important in rating, we rate what we call non-financial element of the business of that municipality. It means we interview every controller in the municipality. Who are the controllers of the municipality? The mayor, the vice mayor, the council, the head of the committees, and also the administrative managers of the different sections in the municipality. When we understand and when we feel that they understand the roles and the roles of others, then that gives us comfort. Many people think that rating of a municipality goes under the sovereign risk. So if a country has a low rating, so no matter what is the rating, how good the municipality is, it is governed, squashed by the sovereign risk. This is not true, because local lending takes away, there is some kind of exposure to the country risk, but not much exposure. So you can have a municipality that is in a country that is not secured risk. However, the municipality could be secured risk. And that is very important in analyzing a municipality.
Thank you. So, Freddie, how does this show up in Latin America? Which kinds of cities actually get access to the capital markets? Is this something that's really very common?
Una primera observación respecto al comentario del tamaño que tú me habías preguntado al principio y que después fue mencionado. Yo no sé si es tanto el tamaño físico, incluso demográfico de la población, pero sí podemos hacer una relación entre dos variables, que es crecimiento demográfico y crecimiento económico. Hay municipios que tienen crecimiento demográfico y crecimiento económico y en general tienen problemas de expansión de la mancha urbana, producción de basura, transporte, etc. Hay otros municipios que tienen crecimiento demográfico pero decrecimiento económico. En general, estos municipios se enfrentan a otro tipo de problemática, crecimiento del empleo precario, del informal. El problema de los residuos no es tan importante porque empieza a aparecer un retratamiento de los residuos dentro de la misma población, aparecen problemas de seguridad, de gobernabilidad. Hay un tercer tipo, digamos, de municipios que tienen decrecimiento económico y decrecimiento demográfico. Es decir, son municipios que han perdido su vocación económica y que a la vez empiezan a expulsar población, o sea, son en general municipios de emigración. Y hay un cuarto tipo de municipio que a veces parece raro, durante un tiempo pensamos que no existía, que son municipios que tienen decrecimiento demográfico, pero crecimiento económico. Esto, por ejemplo, aparece en áreas rurales que tienen un incremento notable de la productividad y, aunque son en su momento cada vez más ricos, expulsan población. ¿A qué nos lleva esto? Que las distintas coyunturas que atraviesan los municipios establecen también una relación entre generación de riqueza y capacidad de contener y conducir el proceso urbano. Entonces, por ejemplo, los municipios que están creciendo tienen muchos problemas, pero están generando los recursos para resolverlos. En cambio, los municipios que crecen demográficamente, pero decrecen económicamente, en general se empobrecen, crece la informalidad, se descapitalizan. Esta primera caracterización creo que es importante, porque no solamente tiene que ver con la inserción de los municipios en la actividad productiva, sino muchas veces también por cómo se insertan ciertos municipios dentro de áreas metropolitanas, o sea, cómo es la posición relativa que asumen dentro del crecimiento general de la ciudad en función de su localización y el tipo de coyuntura que atraviesa ese sector de la ciudad. En general vemos que los municipios de la periferia reciben externalidades negativas de los municipios centrales. Esto en el caso de Buenos Aires es evidente, ¿no? Pero, por otro lado, también puede suceder que hay municipios de la periferia que se ponen muy dinámicos con la valorización de nuevas tierras, de nuevos proyectos inmobiliarios, y asistimos al deterioro en las áreas centrales, como debe haber pasado en algún tiempo en Manila. Entonces, esta primera caracterización creo que también posiciona al municipio frente a las posibilidades de financiamiento, porque hay municipios que siempre les toca lidiar con la pobreza, la incapacidad de hacer frente a requerimientos cada vez mayores, y hay otros municipios que se benefician de, digamos, esta prosperidad, digamos, muchas veces circunstancial, pero que le abre las posibilidades. Por eso es muy importante el establecimiento de marcos regulatorios, de mecanismos de coparticipación, de colaboración solidaria entre municipios y entre partes de la ciudad. Porque justamente, digamos, el funcionamiento total, digamos, genera injusticias de la cual el Estado de alguna manera se tiene que convertir en un reequilibrador, digamos, de las relaciones sociales.
Thank you. I think this is very important. I remember a conversation in Naples at the last World Urban Forum where one of the speakers was asked, what is a well-performing city? Name one. Of course, people came back and said, well, Medellin is a good performing city. Or someone would say Seattle in the United States, or Curitiba. But actually, the list is often very small. If you think about it, if someone asked you, what is a well-performing city, what is on your list? I want you to think about that. Because the list, I think, is embarrassingly small on some of these areas. I'm certainly going to add the mayor's city in Manila, in the Philippines now, but I think it's an interesting question. Matt, can you come in on this question of the capital markets and what qualifies a city to receive attention and support from the capital markets?
Yeah, thanks very much, Mike. I had the good fortune to be involved with the government of South Africa starting about 15 years ago. The government had taken a policy decision that they wanted their municipalities, and especially their metropolitan municipalities, the biggest cities, to borrow from the capital markets. And they wanted them to be able to do this for a whole variety of reasons. First of all, as Ibrahim suggested, they didn't necessarily want to tie up their national balance sheet with the obligations of subnational governments. They were building a new post-apartheid state, and they were going to need a lot of capital for their own purposes. The other thing is that they thought it would be really healthy discipline for the private sector investors to be interacting with the municipalities, to interrogating their finances, their balance sheets, their revenue forecasts, the quality of their management, the quality of their financial strategies. And so they took a policy decision that they wanted private sector finance in a dynamic interaction with the metropolitan municipalities to be the main source of finance, of time-based finance, of borrowing. And it could be borrowing in the form of a loan, it could be borrowing in the form of municipal bonds. We could get into some of the reasons later on why you might want to do one or the other. It could be in the form of a financing lease, it could be in the form of a public-private partnership. Whatever it is, you have to convince the investors that you've got your act together. And so the government of South Africa asked for help in developing a legal and regulatory framework to govern municipal borrowing. And this is another thing that takes time, and it takes vision, and it takes leadership. So as I say, the government of South Africa and the ANC and the National Treasury in South Africa had a clear vision of what they wanted to go. And they were blessed with some very powerful and credible leaders, people like Trevor Manuel, the former Minister of Finance, who carried the vision through almost 5 years of developing the policy into a detailed framework, policy framework, and then translating that into legislation, and then convincing Parliament that this legislation was appropriate. And these things aren't easy. I was talking with Mayor Abalos beforehand. In the process of enacting the South African legislation, Minister Manuel had to convince the Parliament to amend the Constitution twice, as well as to adapt a whole new set of laws. And the amendments were in part about allowing municipalities to pledge assets in the form of future revenue streams and to obligate their successors, and in part on the whole question of long-term obligations. Mayor Abalos mentioned earlier that the term of a mayor is only 3 years. If you're going to invest in infrastructure, which has a 30, 40, 50-year lifespan, you're going to be paying for that over a long time. You can't have a situation where a new mayor is elected and says, well, you know, I know the last guy borrowed a lot of money, you know, to build these streets and water systems, but I don't think that was a good idea. I'm not going to pay it. That's disastrous. So I think developing a legal and regulatory framework that makes it clear that municipalities are obligated over the long term is one approach. I maybe just want to comment on one other thing, because countries do vary. In some countries, in South Africa, for example, there are 3 different spheres, not tiers, 3 different spheres of government, and each is said to be autonomous within its own sphere. In the United States, we have a federal structure, so that state borrowing and city borrowing is never guaranteed by the federal government. Other countries take a different path. Kenya's just adopted a Public Finance Management Act that actually requires the counties secure a sovereign guarantee in order to borrow. And thus they're going to be subject to that sovereign limitation.
Thank you. I'd like to shift the conversation a bit and to ask the Secretary of Gender, Paula, from Medellin. As you hear all of these people talking about finance, and you think about in Medellin how well, I guess the question might be, is money made available to you to make sure that in this city there are expenditures and programs which support the position of women within the city? We're shifting to the question of equity now, and I really wanted you to have the first word on this question.
Por supuesto, nosotros dentro de la administración municipal tenemos un presupuesto asignado para la Secretaría de las Mujeres. Creería que la primera garantía o la primera acción afirmativa que se logra en la ciudad de Medellín para las mujeres es lograr tener una instancia de primer nivel que sea una secretaría poblacional que atienda las problemáticas específicas que vivimos las mujeres y también las apuestas al desarrollo en las que debemos invertir para que las mujeres seamos protagonistas del desarrollo de la ciudad. Entonces, efectivamente, nuestra ciudad cuenta con un presupuesto de inversión anual en los cuales se priorizan recursos para programas y proyectos que favorezcan esa inversión en las mujeres, como les digo, en dos vías. Una, en generar esas garantías para que las mujeres seamos protagonistas del desarrollo, y otras en acciones de necesidades y problemáticas que se atienden específicamente para las mujeres, y que si bien buscamos también transversalizar ese presupuesto para que todas las secretarías y dependencias de la administración sean sensibles al género y generen presupuestos sensibles al género, pues también la secretaría tenga esa capacidad de inversión y esa capacidad de autonomía de reconocer dónde están los puntos sensibles y los puntos importantes que respectan a favorecer la calidad de vida y la garantía de accesibilidad a los derechos a nuestras mujeres en la ciudad.
Gracias. I think in making this switch in the conversation, moving a little bit from the revenue side and the capital market side more towards the expenditure side and posing the question of equity, what I'd like to raise is, in the first half of this conversation up to now, most of the conversation has assumed that we're looking for efficient ways of raising money. We're talking about efficient ways of using it. The mayor's example with the market was clearly efficient. It worked. But what about if our objective is equity? What if our objective is inclusion and social equity? How good are these instruments for actually helping us achieve that objective? And how are there trade-offs? How do we think about those questions? And I think that for some of us this has been a harder question, because, if you will, the technicalities of the revenue side of the property tax, of the credit rating, of assuming that there are public-private partnerships, these are all ways to generate money. But the question, again, I want to pose for all of us is, for what purpose? What's the objective here? And if we're really committed to the question of equity and inclusion, we have to go a step further. And I think that's a hard step to go, because a lot of times that's not the way in which these instruments have been justified nor explained. So I want to make sure that everybody on the panel comes in, and I want to thank the Secretary for her initial comments, and we're going to come back to you on this. But I'd like to ask Larry, what's your take on this? You've been focusing a lot on land-based instruments and on tax policies, but what's the link to equity? How do you see that? And then I'd like to come back to the mayor, because it's one thing to talk about this incredible increase in investment, but what was the purpose? Who benefited? Larry.
I think this is a really critical question, and I appreciate you giving me a chance to respond to it. I think that the equity issue is addressed actually from two different fronts, potentially. One is if we're using well, let me preface my comments by making this observation. I teach public finance to students who are interested in careers in public service. And inevitably in that course, we talk about reasons why some policies should be pursued. And always I'll have several students who say, well, we should do that because it will raise tax revenue. And at that point, I start screaming and yelling and pounding on the table, and I say, no, you cannot ever say to me, we'll do it simply because it raises money. You have to tell me what you're going to do with the money and how the community is going to be better off as a result of that. So I think the instruments that we've been talking about have a tremendous amount of revenue potential, and that potential can be used to improve equity within a community. It can be used to improve infrastructure, transportation, the quality of public services which will benefit the entire community. Now, it's true that it is often the case that a disproportionate amount of that benefit accrues to the people who are best off. But I don't think we should ignore the fact that the people who are most vulnerable are also often made better off as a result of those infrastructure investments. The other observation I would make is that I think this is an important and relatively new observation about the annual tax on property. If you think about the tax on the building as a benefit tax and argue that the amount of tax that a building pays or that the owners of that building pay should be roughly proportional to the services that they receive, so that it becomes the price of public services. But the tax on the land value is socially created, and that's the rationale for having the government or the public say we should share in the value that we created as a public. It's also my observation, my experience, that large landholders who are undertaxed have very little incentive to use their land as productively as it might be used. If we were to tax the land and think about a tax on land as a value sharing mechanism, tax on the building is the benefit tax, the cost of providing services. Tax on the land underneath the building is the public's desire to share in the value that the public has created. We can then, and that the result will be that we'll tax land more heavily than we do buildings, and that will provide an incentive for landowners to either do something more productive with their land or sell it, which increases the access to land, which is a huge issue around the world in terms of equity, to make sure that both women and all parts of the population, all segments of the population, have adequate access to land. I would argue that one of the best ways to do that would be to increase the tax on the land so that it is used more productively. There are examples where this has been done. Pittsburgh in the United States is the case that's often pointed to, where they taxed land at 4 times the rate that they did buildings, and the result was an economic revitalization of a very old and decaying city. There are other instances around the world where the tax on land is heavier than the tax on the buildings, and the result is often a very positive one economically. So in terms of equity, I think, first of all, we recognize what we do with the money can improve equity, and second, we can actually use the instruments themselves if we think about it as a tool that will promote equity.
Thank you. Before turning to the mayor from the Philippines, I want to suggest to the audience a very concrete example to show what I think is involved here. In New York, we have a new mayor, Bill de Blasio, and he ran on the campaign. His campaign was all about equity. And one of the things he said is that we have a city where half of the students don't graduate from high school. They're in high school, but they don't finish. They do badly, they're badly prepared. The educational system does not work very well in New York. And he tied that to what's called pre-K, to pre-kindergarten education. And he noticed that most of these students who don't finish school didn't have any pre-kindergarten education. So as a campaign platform, he said, we will provide pre-K education free to all children in the city. But to pay for that, we will increase the income taxes on every household in the city that makes more than $500,000. The rich. Well, you can imagine there would be a reaction to that. And some of the rich would say, well, that's not so good. Some of the more enlightened people would say, well, we don't know where the money's going to actually be used to go to pre-K, all kinds of political arguments. But this is an example, a concrete example of equity. where he's arguing that we're going to tax the rich to send poor children to pre-K education. And I'd like to come later back to the Secretary and talk about specific programs related to women and related to other groups in Medellin. Because the question of equity is not an abstraction. The question of equity is who benefits, when do they benefit, and how do we see it? So just to convey also the idea that in the place that I live, equity is on the front page of the newspapers every day. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mike. I've been in public office for the last 19 years, almost 2 decades. I started in 1995. I've been mayor since 1998. And for me, the secret is always equity, as Mike said, of the mayor of New York. Because if people will see where their taxes go, we will have no problem with any re-election at all. Actually, we invested these taxes in human development, education. We've won the award as the second city that has generated locally its own income. We've won the best in nutrition, meaning we have the least undernourished children in the Philippines. We are the most child-friendly city as given to us by the President of the Philippines and by the United Nations. And other awards, all in 1 year. If people would see where their taxes go, especially through equity, that is the secret. Remember, we are not running a private corporation. This is politics. We only have 3 years in the Philippines, one of the shortest. So if we miss it, I'm sure we have to pay it in the following year. No? But there must be a balancing act also. And one more thing is that I could show to you one project. And can I show slide 1, please? Slide 1. May I request? Okay. That area is a satellite photo of our cemetery. You see the congestion? It's only 2.5 hectares. Almost 1/2 of our deads are all buried there. And that's a problem for the last 100 years, just like any urban areas. Next slide, please. Just like other cities in the Philippines, when we bury our deads, they go up, just like apartments. Going up because we don't increase the land. We are the smallest city. And if it's so full, what they do is they break the wall of the apartments, we call them apartments, and they get the bones. Next slide, please. It's so populated that we even use the pathways as intermed size of infants, of babies. So you live poor, you die poor. Next, please. And you know what? This is the worst case. Those who are dead, they get their bones, put them into sacks. This one sack is one human being. And his only fault is he died poor. So he was left in this sack. Next slide, please. And this is a warehouse full of bones. 5,000 bones. So this was my predicament 8 years ago. What am I going to do with this? Am I going to allow this? If I'm going to arrange the whole cemetery, I'm going to dig up 5,000 and rearrange. I'm sure the next election, I'll be having protests, I will be sued, and I will lose the election. Again, the premise here is that I'm a politician. So I must use my mind. You know what I did? After the election, I prepared, even before the election. So I made a program where I will dig up 5,000 bodies, rearranged it into something that will really dignity for the poorest of the poor. The thing that you saw a while ago, this is the new cemetery. Next, please. That is the new cemetery. All in 1 year. There must be timing. Timing is important for any local government official. And of course, financing and revenue. So this is where we place it. Actually, it's a one-stop shop. Why? It's 4-in-1. We have the chapel on the right, and then we have a columbarium, a crematory, and niches. I'm sorry I was not able to place the other pictures because of lack of time. I'll explain it to you. Number one, the first thing I did, we're a Roman Catholic country, I asked our priest 8 years ago, Father, do you agree on cremation? And he told me, yes, Mayor. And so I bought a cremation. But it is hard convincing people in my country to cremate because they don't want burning. But, next slide please. Those who do not want to get burned, we place them here in apartments, but they have to sign because after 10 years we are into ashes. So we get the ashes and place them, next please. This is the crematorium. You know, in the Philippines, it's 40,000 to be burned. But I must be practical. I must use my management side. What I did, I brought down the price from 40,000 to just 2,000 pesos. It's a discount. So it's a marketing strategy, but everyone said, that's good, Mayor, I'll have my dead cremated. Next slide, please. Now, this is the secret. I personally designed this. This is our columbarium. Imagine, this is supposed to be good only for 300 persons, but now it's good for 2,592 urns because you will be placing those cremated here. So this solved the problem. And you know what? Even if I brought down the price of cremation, we are still earning from it. I was surprised of how much people from the funerals will really get their income. It's profitable to run a funeral parlor. I was surprised. But with this will show how sensitive and delicate it is as a mayor to run a city. But if you have political will, if you're transparent, my secret is I keep no secrets with my people. At first, they were rallying against me. They were mad. But I've told them, look, this is our problem. What do we do? And after I convinced them, this is the secret. This was adjudged as the best cemetery in the Philippines. And I won a presidential award for this. We call it Galing Pook Award. Thank you.
You know, we hear a lot of words frequently about equity and life cycles and things. But frankly, this is the first time, Mr. Mayor, I've heard this brought into this kind of a meeting. And I think it's pretty surprising to all of us. But I think it's really an extraordinary example. Paula, I'd like to ask you, going to the earlier part in the life cycle, thinking about children in the city, in Medellin. What happens to children in Medellin? What happens in terms of the role of the city government? And how do you manage opportunities for children? And how does this relate to the overall growth and prosperity of this city?
Medellín cuenta con dos programas fundamentales para el acompañamiento de los niños y las niñas. El programa Buen Comienzo es el programa que se lidera desde el año 2005 con la intención de acompañar y garantizar un desarrollo integral en la primera infancia. Trabajamos con los niños desde su edad gestante, o sea, trabajamos con las madres gestantes, las acompañamos en su ciclo de desarrollo del embarazo y acompañamos a los niños entre los 0 y los 5 años de edad, donde lo que estamos garantizando primero es una cobertura que ya asciende al más del 82%, iniciamos con un 15%. Ahora lo estamos haciendo con el 82% de la niñez, principalmente con los estratos 1 y 2 y los que logramos cubrir con el estrato 3. Cuando hablamos de ese desarrollo integral, es tanto la parte formativa como la parte también de la parte formativa como la parte creativa, y es también cómo lograr aprovechar esos 5 años de vida, porque lo que tenemos como política de ciudad es reconocer que si invertimos en la primera infancia vamos a garantizar una repercusión positiva en esa inversión en todos los años de vida, ¿cierto? Esto por lo menos en el ciclo vital de vida de ese ser humano. Pasando del programa de Buen Comienzo, contamos con el programa de jornada complementaria. ¿Qué buscamos con jornada complementaria? Que los niños y las niñas y los adolescentes que van entre los 6 y los 18 años de edad, que son los que están en ese ciclo de formación de educación básica, tengan espacios formativos, recreativos, que generen sentido de pertenencia en la escuela, otras alternativas fuera del currículo que propone la institución educativa y se puedan formar como líderes en sus áreas y de esta manera en las áreas que tienen interés los niños y las niñas, y de esta manera también estamos garantizando potenciar nuevos talentos. Los niños eligen si es una segunda lengua, entonces tienen clubes de inglés después de las clases que tienen, es una jornada extracurricular. Y tienen inglés, medio ambiente, toda el área de investigación y ciencia, y también hay un área de participación social y política para los niños que quieren comenzar, los niños y las niñas que quieren comenzar a empoderarse para ser nuestros próximos líderes en pocos años. Entonces estos son los dos programas fundamentales en términos de la niñez de que acompañamos. Ya pues ya tenemos otra parte que es el acompañamiento en educación superior, y es cómo lograr garantizar el acceso a educación superior, o sea, a la universidad, a los jóvenes de la ciudad mediante el Fondo EPM, que también se garantiza esa accesibilidad en educación. Lo que también se busca con estos programas principalmente es con el tópico que estamos tocando pues en este momento del panel, es esas garantías de cómo aportar a que esas brechas de inequidad sean reales, principalmente teniendo como foco de trabajo la educación.
Thank you very much. Matt, you want to come in on this?
Thanks, Mike. I'm glad we're talking about equity. As we all know in this room, we sit at the intersection of two main trends here in the early part of the 21st century. Urbanization continues at a very rapid rate, especially in the developing world. And income inequality, unfortunately, is also growing. So this makes, as our General Counsel Anne-Marie Leroy said in her talk yesterday, this makes really for a potentially very explosive situation. And we've seen social unrest in many large cities in the world over the past couple of years. And it's going, I imagine, to continue to be a challenge for cities. So we need to think about equity not only in the question of the expenditure side, which Larry focused our attention on, but also very much in the source of revenue side. I remember several years ago, we at the World Bank were advising the governments in East Africa, in Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, to raise their local revenues. And sometimes the result of that advice was an unintended consequence, which was that cities would go around and round up the poor and vulnerable and exact a head tax from them. And you know, what that taught me is that it matters very much where you get the money from. So what we did in that case was we then did a model of possible revenue sources under Tanzanian and Ugandan law that might be available to local governments, several different types. And we did some models and some analysis based on the impact. We divided the household income data we had up into deciles. And we said, okay, where does the tax burden fall if we use tax A or tax B or tax C? And we, you know, I won't defend the methodology as being rigorous. We made a lot of assumptions. But it fed into the dialogue between the cities and the national government about what kind of tax authority cities should have and how they should use it. Larry mentioned the property taxes and specifically the land tax, which is, I think, a very important idea. It goes back to Henry George, the famous economist. But there's another practical reality. You said at the beginning, Mike, let's talk practicalities. In many cities in the developing world, the class of large property owners overlaps with the politically influential classes. And so you have this situation where you're trying to convince the elite of the city, the top 1 to 10%, depending on the city, that they should actually tax themselves for the benefit of the other 90%. And that can be a very hard sell. But I think, again, if we look at the unrest and strife and the insecurity that happens in our cities, you can begin to see it's a good bargain. I remember maybe 2 decades ago when Mayor Washington, a populist black mayor from the south side of Chicago, was elected. he said, you know, we're not going to tax the rich to death. In fact, what we're going to do is we're going to tax the rich. But we're also going to provide first-class services along the lake shore and the North End so that they want to stay in Chicago, so that they don't move out to the suburbs, so that we have their assets and their contributions available for redistribution in the city. So I think thinking consciously about who's paying is a very important piece of this. And one final aspect of this, I want to bring in again something that Larry said earlier. He talked about developer exactions. One way this can come up is what we call connection fees or tap fees. If you, as a city, build a new water treatment plant, sewer plant, electric plant, and then you finance it over time, you've got a lot of costs and a lot of carrying costs in the financing. And if you leave that on the municipal balance sheet and try to recover that over time out of tariffs from your population, those tariffs have to be relatively high. Whereas, if you sell off the capacity that you've created as properties are developed, so that the developer, the builder, puts those costs into his or her sales price, and then it becomes financed on the mortgage side by the private owner, you get the public sector out of financing that much earlier, and you can keep your tariffs much lower. So again, as we think about innovative financing tools, it's not just how much and how adequate and how reliable, but also what's the effect on different segments of society, on businesses, and so on.
Thank you. I want to, up to now, we haven't talked about two things which connect very much to this question. The first is user charges. We haven't talked about how nobody's really mentioned whether the charge for water or electricity or other kinds of direct charges are part of this question of raising finance, raising revenue to support these things. And I'd like to get the panel thinking a little bit more about the role of user charges, because I remember conversations in various countries where people would say, why should we be charging the poor for water in a site and service project or in a slum upgrading program if at the same time the rich and the middle class in this city are receiving water at a very subsidized rate? Where's the equity in that? That doesn't make any sense. And I think many of us can remember the protests by low-income people who are right that there was a basic inequity in the charging, in the use of user charges in many places. Well, that's one part of it. But the second part of it, which we also haven't discussed, are subsidies. And subsidies are very present. So in many countries, if we look at the prices that are paid for people in the formal sector, they're a bargain. If you paid for electricity in Buenos Aires or water in Buenos Aires and you were a middle-class household, you're doing very well because you're not paying the full price, or at least up until a couple of weeks ago when the governments decided to selectively reduce the subsidies, protect the poor and tax the rich a little bit more. But the question of subsidies seems to me to be another important issue here. So it's one thing to talk about direct sources of revenue and specific expenditures, but if there are these underlying subsidies to particular groups, we're basically not going to improve the equity very much. And I would say here that it's very interesting in this region, in Latin America, where we've had a massive change since 2002 in terms of politics, with many countries with progressive governments. There's been very little change in the structure of subsidies. So subsidies are an important part of this calculation. So I'd like to get the panel into this, and Ibrahim was asking to speak before, and let me turn first to him and then to Freddie.
It's interesting that we talk about subsidy just directly after talking. I remember when we spoke. Okay, it's interesting we are talking about subsidy directly after we spoke about equity, and then you link the two together. I remember when. Thank you. Once again. Okay. How did it start? Rewind. It's interesting that we are talking about subsidy. After we were talking about equity, I remember a few weeks ago when we had our conference call, and I promised the panelists that I will share with them a slide that is very interesting. I use it in my work as an actuary when we talk about subsidies. And it is about 3 children watching a football game, and the 3 of them, age 5, 7, and 11, standing on 3 stools on the same height. That's equally, each one of them have received the same height of a stool. So they are treated equally, but there's no equity here. The young child barely see over the fence, the middle child have his eyes directly over the fence, and the eldest child didn't need a stool anyway. So who treated them is indifferent about their needs. A parent, here I want to be a gender correct, I didn't say a father, a parent, whether mother or father, gives an allowance for their children in an equitable way. Never a parent gives a child who is 3 and a child of 7 and a child who is 11 the same allowance. They give them different allowances. So the unit of the family is the ideal unit in equity-wise. So if we look at this picture and take a decision that government, local authorities would look at their constituents in an equitable way and give these people what their needs more than what we treat them equally. Yesterday I was listening to a speaker from Ecuador and was saying that in one of the provinces, or I don't know if it's all Ecuador, but at least it's in his province, they provide food, breakfast for all children aged 0 to 5 free of charge in all schools. In my opinion, that will come now to the main decision of equity. There's something should go before that. You have to understand the population, the way the parents understand their children. There should be surveys of needs. Maybe you are treating some families who are short-sighted by giving them comfort that, oh, we give them free education, free breakfast, go generate some children. And then at age 6, they are on the street. Nobody's taking care of them. So I would rather see the cities educating the families not to have too many children. If you cannot afford them, you cannot give them breakfast, why should you bring them to this life? So it's a matter of knowing your population that you are governing. You have a responsibility of being long-sightedness. I'm an actuary, so most of my work is 35 years to 75 years projection. I seldom do any work projecting 5 years ahead. So we don't see municipalities looking ahead. They build buildings, sky rises, and all of a sudden they cause traffic jams, or they cause sewage overflows, or they cause many other problems. So they should really look at the demographics of their countries, of their cities. The socio-economic conditions are very important to decide what kind of subsidies, how can you treat people in equitable way. It's not just, oh, I treat everybody equal. So I would like to stop at this stage, and then we can talk later about.
I think that's a very powerful example of the watching the football game in the different age groups, right? Equal treatment doesn't lead to equal outcome, right? And possibilities. Freddie, would you like to come in on this?
A mí me interesa para hablar del tema de equidad y terminar, digamos, viendo el tema de los subsidios, digamos, como un mecanismo de generar vasos comunicantes, que observemos que la forma de producir ciudad viene teniendo una cierta incapacidad para abarcar a la totalidad. O sea, si miramos la racionalidad que describíamos recién del sistema financiero, del aparato productivo formal, llamémosle de alguna manera, bueno, vemos que está regido con una racionalidad que tiene que ver con la realización de la tasa de ganancia. Pero objetivamente, encontramos que una parte importante de la población produce ciudad respondiendo a otras lógicas, formas artesanales, manufactureras, formas de autoconstrucción. Algunos lo caracterizarían como marginal, informal, otros hablarían de una economía popular, pero que tiene como particularidad que su racionalidad central no es la reproducción de la tasa de ganancia, sino la reproducción de la vida. Es decir, si observamos nuestra realidad, es objetivo, digamos, constatar que la mayor parte de la producción de nuestras ciudades obedece a estas racionalidades y no a esta racionalidad dominante. Los gobiernos hacen tremendos esfuerzos, y sobre todo en algunos países, para, digamos, establecer estos mecanismos de captura de renta, de captura de valor para después distribuirlo socialmente. Pero la matriz sobre la que se apoyan, en general, trata de llevar la sociedad sobre esa racionalidad dominante y no aprovechar las capacidades, digamos, que expresa esta economía social, digamos, que en última instancia produce una parte sustancial de nuestras ciudades. Yo creo en este punto que es importante revisar los mecanismos de planificación para que justamente incorporen, digamos, políticas que redistribuyan, digamos, los recursos en función del desarrollo de estas otras dimensiones de la economía, de formas asociativas barriales, de sociedades de fomento, de formas cooperativas, de empresas populares, de pequeñas y medianas empresas, lo que supone revisar las formas, por ejemplo, como se adjudican la construcción de los conjuntos de vivienda, las formas como se asignan los materiales de construcción, la forma como se definen los precios de las cosas, las formas como se establecen los sistemas tributarios que muchas veces dejan a todos estos sectores de la economía en la ilegalidad. Es decir, creo que aquí se abre, digamos, una dimensión importante, es decir, porque cuando miramos, por ejemplo, respecto de la gestión del suelo, cuáles son los países que vienen trayendo saltos sustanciales, y en la región encontramos, por ejemplo, que Colombia o Brasil, en donde encontramos las experiencias más interesantes de redistribución de rentas de suelo, tienen que ver con cambios constitucionales que pusieron en duda, por ejemplo, la naturaleza de la propiedad y le asignan a la propiedad una función social y ecológica previa, digamos, al ejercicio de la propiedad privada. Entonces, estas cuestiones, por ejemplo, desencadenan instrumentos de acción diferentes, pero tienen que ver con una revisión de supuestos básicos de cómo se produce en la ciudad. Esta revisión de supuestos básicos permite, por ejemplo, introducir la noción de suelo creado, que es superadora de lo que es en el régimen legal de todos nuestros otros países, la noción de restricciones al dominio. Es decir, no es que el propietario tiene una propiedad previa y que después ejerce un derecho y la sociedad restringe ese derecho, sino que la sociedad le habilita esa capacidad de producir ciudad más allá, digamos, de la tenencia del suelo. Es decir, estos cambios, digamos, permiten operaciones más complejas, como por ejemplo operaciones de definición de proyectos urbanos que suponen un reparcelamiento. Y en este punto sí se aplican criterios como los que nos hablaba en estos días el doctor Clos, de parcelar pequeño para que las licitaciones las ganen pequeñas empresas, de que las políticas de vivienda prioricen intervenciones de financiamiento sobre el patrimonio construido y no sobre la construcción de vivienda nueva, mejoramiento de barrio, ampliación de vivienda, construcción de una segunda vivienda en una parcela que ya está ocupada, arriba o al fondo. Nosotros en este momento estamos implementando un programa que se llama Procrear, que justamente apunta a esto, es decir, canaliza fondos de pensión, pero tiene un porcentaje de subsidio de, digamos, del Ministerio de Economía, que trata de equilibrar, digamos, el valor de la inflación en relación al valor del salario y asumiendo, digamos, el diferencial que pueda producirse en este punto. Pero lo que apunta justamente es a facilitar procesos de mejoramiento, construcción sobre el parque habitacional ya existente. En este punto, el paso que sigue, yo creo que en este sentido ha habido también experiencias interesantes, es cuando el Estado asume formas público-privadas de producción de suelo urbano e interactúa dentro del mercado del suelo, promoviendo crecimiento sobre zonas que el mercado no indica o dirigidos a sectores que el mercado no contempla. Es decir, claro, cada vez que aparece la idea del Estado interactuando con el mercado, digamos, en la producción de ciudad, y esto genera debates de fondo. Yo creo que una de las cosas interesantes que ha pasado en el urbanismo en los últimos 15, 20 años es que ha desarrollado una valija de herramientas mucho más sofisticada y sobre todo que posibilita la estructuración de dispositivos que combinan herramientas con verdadera capacidad de incidir sobre la evolución, digamos, del mercado de suelos.
Thank you very much. That's very, very important observations. Paula, I'd like to ask you to go beyond your job as the Secretary for Gender for the city to tell us a little bit about in Medellin about subsidies in Medellin. How do the finances go here from the social perspective? Are the rich heavily subsidized here in the cost of transport or in water? How do you see the situation from your perspective?
Desde la Secretaría de las Mujeres tenemos 5 áreas de trabajo y 5 áreas de intervención en las cuales priorizamos el acompañamiento a las mujeres que requieren aún esa garantía de accesibilidad a los derechos. Entonces estamos hablando de un área de educación, un área de autonomía económica, un área de reconocimiento, un área de participación social y política y de seguridad pública para las mujeres. Con respecto a la Secretaría, pues principalmente las acciones que se realizan es con el fin de generar esa posibilidad de que las mujeres cada vez tengamos más participación y más incidencia en la toma de decisiones de la construcción de ciudad. Entonces, por eso mismo hay una inversión alta en términos de educación, y las 2 inversiones más altas que tiene la Secretaría es en términos de autonomía económica y de seguridad pública para las mujeres. En autonomía económica, dentro del acompañamiento que hacemos en términos de emprendimiento, en términos de generación de ingresos, de trabajar con las mujeres rurales, porque también para nosotros es muy importante como ciudad reconocer que el 71% del territorio de la ciudad es rural y que las mujeres rurales pues requieren un acompañamiento en esa generación de ingresos, que lo que les exija o finalmente la decisión que tengan que tomar no sea venir a la urbe o estar en la parte urbana de la ciudad, sino lograr potencializar los recursos que tenemos en el área rural. Entonces hay un trabajo muy interesante y muy fuerte en lo que respecta a autonomía económica, y allí aparece uno de los subsidios que nosotros como Secretaría manejamos o le aportamos a la ciudad, y es con las madres comunitarias. Las madres comunitarias son las mujeres que se encargan de ese cuidado de los niños en su primera infancia, que también están articuladas al proyecto de Buen Comienzo, y que lo que buscamos es en una acción afirmativa aportar un recurso bimensual que representa el 10% de un salario mínimo, y que lo que buscamos con este subsidio es que ellas puedan pagar los servicios públicos de sus casas para poder garantizar una atención adecuada y pues saneada de lo que requiere el cuidado de los niños y las niñas en sus espacios, en sus hogares, porque es en esos espacios donde ellas realizan su actividad cotidiana, y ellas son las llamadas madres comunitarias. Entonces ahí hay una parte del subsidio. Entonces, con respecto al tema de educación, está un proyecto que también es muy valioso para la ciudad, que se llama La Escuela Busca a la Mujer Adulta, donde también, pues más que un subsidio, lo que buscamos son acciones afirmativas, o también lo que hemos denominado en otro concepto como discriminaciones positivas, y es que a las mujeres les garantizamos alimentación, transporte y cuidado de sus niños y niñas para que puedan ir a estudiar y terminar su ciclo de educación básico o de formación básico. Entonces, son todas este tipo de acciones. Ya la tercera inversión que les digo que es muy alta en la Secretaría es la inversión en seguridad pública, donde principalmente en estos momentos estamos haciendo un esfuerzo bastante grande por tener una plataforma de atención que nos garantice que las mujeres puedan tener confianza, credibilidad y tengan una atención eficiente cuando son víctimas de violencia basada en género. Entonces, allí contamos con una línea 123 Mujer, que es una línea de emergencia, contamos con una defensoría técnica, o sea, la Secretaría tiene un convenio con la entidad llamada Defensoría del Pueblo, que es quien asigna los defensores públicos para llevar llevar pues como todo el proceso de defensa cuando se interpone una demanda, y son abogados y abogadas con enfoque de género que garantizan esa atención de las mujeres, y también pues en estos momentos, teniendo en cuenta lo que significa pues lo importante que es que nosotras también estemos accediendo a la tecnología, realizamos un aplicativo que también en estos momentos pues ya está en revisión para poderlo poner al servicio de la ciudad y del país, donde las mujeres puedan desde sus teléfonos celulares también pedir atención y encontrar las rutas de atención en términos de seguridad. La pregunta también pues que nos hace el moderador es un poco más amplia y nos pregunta sobre la parte de subsidios en la ciudad, y pues yo me enfocaría principalmente en los subsidios que respectan al tema social, que es más manejado por la Secretaría de Inclusión Social y Familia, quien atiende a los grupos, lo que llamamos grupos vulnerables o minorías, que también pues son unas minorías dentro de la gran mayoría. Se tienen unos subsidios específicos, por ejemplo, para la población en situación de discapacidad, para la población adulto mayor, y para ciertos grupos poblacionales que se requieren unas atenciones especiales que garantice la accesibilidad con satisfacción a sus derechos fundamentales.
Thank you very much. In a few moments, I'm going to open up the floor for questions, and there will be some microphones here. But there's one condition. We've all been in these experiences where people are invited to ask questions and they give speeches. So I want to give you fair warning. What we would like you to do is only ask, all your sentences have to end with a question mark. So actually we only want one sentence, one question, and what we will do is collect a group of questions, and then we'll invite the panel to respond as they wish. I want you to think about that. That is coming. Before we go there, though, I want to be a little bit more provocative in this conversation. Yesterday, my colleague Robert Buckley from the New School gave a presentation where he talked about some of the recent work of a French economist, Thomas Piketty, who has shown that if you have in a city, or if you have in a country, the rate of return on capital, if that rate of return is higher than the rate of growth in the country, the people who have capital will always be making more and more money compared to what's going on in the rest of the country. And this kind of analysis demonstrates that there are very strong pressures for the rich always to get richer, and there not to actually be more equity. Now, there's a lot of discussion, and I apologize to those of you who really know Piketty. This is a rather simplified presentation of it. But it seems to me that there are dynamics going on in our cities where the rich are getting richer. And at the same time, we have huge numbers of people in the city. So one of the questions that I think we have to ask here, and I want to push the panel on this, is we're rowing upstream. We're climbing up a mountain, which is very steep. It's getting worse all the time. So public finance and the way in which we raise money and spend money has to be stronger and stronger to overcome the dynamics of the market and the dynamics of wealth in countries. So now let's tighten this up a little bit. Now it's going to get tougher. What do you think about this, Mr. Mayor?
It's indeed a very provocative question, Mr. Cohen. Well, one thing about these dynamics is that, as far as I'm concerned personally, there must be a trickling down effect. Whatever revenues we have had, whatever we have had from the rich, the poor, the underprivileged, must feel that they are part of this growth. That is the main issue here. And that is what we've done. In my city, we have taxed the rich, but we made sure that there is transparency. And there's a saying, if you feed a man a fish a day, you'll be only feeding him for 1 day. But if you teach him how to fish, you will be feeding him for a lifetime. It is within this context that we have made our programs. Number one, we have made a law that all investments in our city, 80% of their employees should come from our workforce, and most of these are from the poor areas. But the problem is most of the poor are not skilled, they're not educated. So every city has its own program for education, that's one. But how about those who cannot afford formal education? My city heavily invested on that as part of the equity, and in fact, we've made it as the best vocational school in our country. But we harvested so much because the poor will now go here. In 6 months, they will have diplomas. It was so successful that even those from abroad, let's say Marriott Hotel, will go to that school and get the graduates from the slum area and bring them to Malaysia. So for me, that is the trickling down effect. Even if we get investors, even if our revenues are big, at least the poor, will feel that they're part of that growth. The secret here is education, and very, very important, it's employment. Now, subsidy. For the Philippines, electricity and water, they're private. But in our city, what we heavily subsidize on are the slums. We try to buy properties and then have the beneficiaries pay for us for the next 30 years. No? So they pay to us. For me, that is a form of subsidy. But how can they pay if they have no jobs? So our policy will be, if you want to be a beneficiary, you get a job. But Mayor, I'm not skilled. You go to this school. After 6 months, I will make sure you will have a job. So that's the secret, Mike. No? As far as we're concerned in the city, we made sure that there will be this trickling down effect. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt?
So look, I'm kind of like Mayor Washington in Chicago. I don't really mind the rich as long as they pay the full price. What's really troubling about subsidies, and I think you were hinting at that, Mike, is that in many cities, the price of services for the whole population are held artificially low on the grounds that we can't charge high prices for water because the poor can't afford it. And I think what our colleague from Medellin said is, for example, in her program with the community mothers, what they do is they charge the price for water that it costs to produce the water, but then they provide a targeted subsidy to help pay for the cost. And I think, you know, there's a huge difference between a generalized subsidy and a carefully targeted subsidy. Here in Latin America, they've had such great success with things like the Bolsa Familia and other kinds of income grants that would enable the poor to pay the cost of services. I think the other thing is that the rich don't necessarily want to live in a decaying city full of slums. They would also like to live in a prosperous city where the general level of education and participation is high. In a lot of Western Europe and the United States, when we started including women in the workforce, we all got richer. I saw a study just this week saying that if the Europeans, and especially in Eastern and Central Europe, would include the Roma, it would bring up the level of the economy there. I think, you know, most rich people who, again, think long-term and want their children to grow up in a society that's stable and not troubled by, you know, yesterday I visited the Plaza San Antonio here where I saw the results of the bomb explosion in 1995 that killed many innocent people. You know, whether that was predominantly an economic war, I don't know, but I know that our cities are volatile, and unless we think about how to bring the outcomes to a more equitable level for all citizens, the rich citizens of the future aren't going to live in a stable society.
Thank you. Raheem?
Thanks. I would like to use 4 small stories on this. I'm unlike Matt. I do have a problem with the rich. although I'm wearing a bow tie, I come from a village, and I grew up. My dad does not have a 5th grade education, and he worked all his life to send me to universities. And like many people that go to university, our objective is to make money. And that over the years, just until recently, I've learned that this is not happiness. So I do have problem with the rich. 8 years ago, I gave all my properties, all my companies away, and I'm a much happier person. Although I'm a Catholic, I live in a Muslim world, and I was introduced recently to the concept of zakat, which is a taxation. I was very impressed that they tax unusable assets. This is something that is what Larry just mentioned, that land that is not used should be heavily taxed so that encourage property building. Muslims, they tax unusable assets. So if a lady puts her jewelry in a safe deposit box and does not use it, in principle, she should pay tax on it. If she uses it and flaunts it and enjoys it, she doesn't have to pay tax on it. That's a very interesting concept. So let me come back to the other two things that I'd like to mention. For the past 10 odd years, I've been working heavily in Africa. And I see the rich robbing systematically the poor. And the rich, I can put them in two categories. One, the telecommunication companies, and the others. The telecommunication companies have found a way to make the general African population addicted to use cell phones. You see everybody on the street, no matter how much they earn, they are on their cell phones. And they work their butt off just to put bundles, to put airtime on their cell phones. They are addicted to the use of cell phones to the point that is the best tax collection company. The telecom agencies, they just rob people systematically. We did a study worldwide. It is typical that every individual of ours spend a percentage of their income to housing, percentage on food, percentage on education, percentage on clothing, and percentage on transportation and telecommunication. In Africa, the highest percentage of their income spent on telecommunication. That is alarming. I don't know anything about South America because I don't know, but in Africa, I wish the mayors of Africa make systematic education to their people not to use telephone as much as they are. In my last remark, I was told yesterday we should really leave the conference with something to remember. I was asked once by a student in university when I was lecturing about my philosophy of work, and I was asked, how would I measure accomplishment? And my answer was, with the number of people that will cry after I die. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Larry, that's a tough act to follow, I think.
That's a very tough act to follow. So, but I appreciated your comments very, very much. I want to add just a couple of observations about the Colombian experience. I think one of the forms of subsidies that I think is very interesting here, that raises both some possibilities and identifies, I think, some challenges, is that there's a national agency that assigns an economic strata to every house in the country. And there are 6 of these strata, if I got that correct. And the utility bills for the bottom 2 or 3 strata are subsidized by charging higher utility rates to the upper strata. So there's a direct transfer subsidy and through user charges from the wealthy to the low income. But I think it also points out a big challenge that we mentioned at the beginning but really need to come back and visit again, especially if we're interested in equity and promoting the interests of society's most vulnerable. The need for administrative capacity in government becomes astronomically larger. We have to have an agency who has the competence to say this house belongs in strata 3 but not strata 4. This property should be subject to a higher tax than this other property. It's a different classification. And as soon as you add the administrative judgments and the administrative demands in order to promote equity, the capacity of your governments to be able to do that effectively and fairly goes up very substantially. And I'm not sure that many local governments in most developing countries have that capacity. They're struggling now, at least as I've gone around the world and talked to governments about improving their land-based revenue systems. Participants in the classes that I've taught have always come back and said, how do we do that when we don't have the administrative capacity to do it? So I think we have to be very creative. I agree wholeheartedly with the notion that equity and human flourishing should be the objective of every organization and every public entity and every city in the world. But how we get there, given the administrative capacity and both the legal structure and the administrative abilities that we have, is, I think, a major challenge that we have to confront in the near term if we're going to make serious progress in that area.
Thank you. Before turning over to Freddie, I just want to make one comment. This issue of equal treatment is also something important. We haven't used the term social justice in this panel. But obviously, to achieve some form of equity, there has to be the perception that there is social justice in the way the institutions are behaving. And in some cases, this has to do with things like technically deciding one property has a value and another property has another value. So there is a relationship between technical capacity and institutional capacity and the perception of social justice. And I would argue it may not matter that the subsidies are all right. If we don't see them as being all right, it's not going to work. Okay, so this is another dimension of that. Freddie, will you?
Yo no sé si, digamos, si me preocupa la riqueza, pero sí el dolor, digamos, los dramas a los que se ven sometidos los más pobres. Y desde esa perspectiva, muy frecuentemente nos parece abusivo, ofensivo, digamos, las expresiones de riqueza que a veces toman algunas sociedades, incluso las conductas segregativas, digamos, que a veces toman los sectores más favorecidos respecto de los sectores más desfavorecidos de la sociedad. Por eso lo que creo es que hay una tarea fundamental, que es desmontar el discurso que naturaliza esa inequidad. Y, digamos, yo creo que eso es una contribución, digamos, que tiene que hacer la investigación, que tiene que hacer, digamos, la difusión del conocimiento. Es la operación que debemos hacer en talleres de este tipo, es decir, de desmontar, digamos, los argumentos que supuestamente sostienen la naturalidad de estos procesos que generan la inequidad. En esta perspectiva creo que la mayor forma de conocimiento es el intento de transformar la realidad, y en ese sentido creo que lo que más valoro son las experiencias que hacen las comunidades locales, justamente intentando formas organizativas, formas de lucha, digamos, para recomponer estas condiciones de equidad, recuperar derechos, acceder a cosas que en el mercado le están prohibidas, y en este punto también entra el papel de los estados como garantes, como estimuladores, como representantes, digamos, de estas expectativas, digamos, de las mayorías de nuestras sociedades. Creo en esto que este foro es un momento extraordinario en este sentido. La posibilidad de construir una agenda que marque pautas para las políticas de los gobiernos del mundo es un hito central que no deberíamos desperdiciar. Gracias.
Very good. Thank you. Paula.
Posiblemente en este nivel de la conversación y en algunos niveles que ha tenido el panel, podríamos preguntarnos si quien debe hablar en términos financieros y de inversión en la ciudad sería la Secretaría de las Mujeres. Posiblemente sería mejor pensar, bueno, también debería estar alguien desde la experiencia local, de planeación, de Secretaría de Hacienda, y creería que ahí pues quiero aprovechar para agradecer el que sea la Secretaría de las Mujeres quien sea la invitada a participar de este panel, porque habla también de una acción afirmativa, de querer reconocer pues cómo se deben de proyectar y se deben considerar en los gobiernos locales inversiones sensibles al género, inversiones que realmente favorezcan y aceleren la participación de las mujeres en lo público, para que en otros momentos seamos más mujeres las que las acompañemos a ustedes a hablar de esa inversión desde un estamento público. Por lo mismo no quisiera pues como centrarme en la discusión entre la distribución de la riqueza y pensar la relación entre ricos y pobres, sino hacer referencia a dos asuntos fundamentales que nos pueden garantizar esa relación de equidad dentro de los estratos y las divisiones de riqueza que tenemos en la ciudad, y es lo primero es generar acciones de formación para que realmente tengamos una ciudadanía formada para participar. Si la ciudadanía está formada para participar, sea en el estrato 6 o en el estrato 1, va a haber una garantía del disfrute de lo público de una manera distinta y sin precariedad y sin marginalidad. Y lo segundo es dignificar, por lo mismo, el espacio público. Si dignificamos los espacios públicos, queriendo decir que se haga lo mejor y se invierta lo mejor, tanto para el estrato 1 como para el estrato 6, también vamos a garantizar romper con esas brechas, que en muchos casos también son unas brechas bastante fuertes en términos imaginarios, en términos culturales y sociales, que independiente que pensemos en acciones tributarias o en acciones de ahora lo que llamábamos subsidios, para disminuir esas brechas, pues van a seguir estando ahí los imaginarios culturales que son los más difíciles de romper. Entonces, la dignificación del espacio público es algo muy importante y que creo que es lo que más cercano hoy les podemos compartir de nuestra ciudad. Es la transformación de Medellín. Lo que hemos logrado es dignificar los espacios públicos para que tanto personas con escasos recursos económicos como quien tienen mejores facilidades económicas puedan acceder a lo mejor. Ahí está la red de bibliotecas públicas, que es un ejemplo, las unidades de vida articulada y sobre todo la dignificación de los espacios deportivos como una accesibilidad y un derecho a la recreación. Entonces creería que ahí también hay una posibilidad muy potencializadora de generar también esos procesos de distribución de la riqueza, pero sobre todo de la relación entre los estratos sociales.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open this up for questions. So if you have a question, remember, one sentence with a question mark. Okay. Paula has another session she's participating in. Thank you. Okay, please. We have some microphones here? Many. Okay, please. I suggest that people who have questions, you should move to the aisles, so it'd be easier to pass them on. Please, brief question.
My name is Himi Syed from Toronto, Canada. I have not heard about CityStat, CompStat, Moneyball for governments. If anyone's seen the movie Moneyball, it's finding money within the approved budgets that are legacy programs that are surplus now and internally trading them between the departments of municipality. Why have not I heard about what cities can do with the money they're already not spending properly?
Thank you. Okay, we're going to collect a group of questions and then we'll turn to the panel. Thank you. Next.
In Spanish, please.
Sí.
Gracias. Buenos días. Quisiera preguntar, en el contexto del conflicto interno colombiano, teniendo en cuenta que existe una gran cantidad de víctimas que llegan a las ciudades de Colombia, ¿cómo se puede garantizar el acceso a la propiedad de la tierra urbana, a la vivienda, partiendo del hecho de que gran parte de las medidas de las alcaldías y de los gobiernos locales tienden a subir los precios del suelo y se hacen inaccesibles para esta población que no tiene tampoco medios económicos para poder tener vivienda? Gracias.
Yes. Next.
Hola, buenos días. Yo soy John Jairo Zuluaga. Bienvenidos a Medellín. Yo tengo prácticamente una pregunta dirigida al profesor Larry con respecto a lo siguiente. Colombia, en particular desde el Plan Nacional de Desarrollo, se dio luz verde para incrementar el impuesto predial. Estos impuestos han llevado a que muchas de las personas no tengan capacidad de pago. Escuché dos de sus apreciaciones, una de ellas enfocada al término de que la plusvalía era mejor recibirla en el tiempo, gradualmente y no de una sola vez, pero también usted afirmaba que había que elevar el valor de la tierra para poder que se dinamizara. Entonces, ¿cómo lograr el equilibrio entre esto para garantizar que haya justicia social, equidad e inclusión entre todas las personas, pero que el gobierno local también reciba lo que le debe pertenecer? Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias.
Buenos días y muchas gracias. Mi nombre es Miguel Ángel Arias. Quería que los panelistas me contestaran.
Más cerca del micrófono. Sí.
Quería que los panelistas me contestaran si es posible vencer la tiranía de la banca internacional y especialmente en nuestro país, en Colombia, que se ha apoderado de las decisiones públicas. Se han hecho dueños de las finanzas públicas, especialmente territoriales, a través de leyes como las leyes de ajuste fiscal, lo que implica que las decisiones que toman muchos de nuestros gobernantes locales no obedecen a los criterios que concertan con las comunidades, sino que obedecen a las imposiciones que le hace la banca a través de los planes de ajuste fiscal. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Yeah, my name is Alpha Joe Cham from Sierra Leone. What I want to ask is, first of all, I want to link the financing options to the responsibility of the state and that of the local government. What is not clear is what are the responsibilities of the state and that of the local government in providing urban services. And that is important because that defines the financing options. And so the question is, what are the responsibilities of the state, the national state, or the central government, and what are the responsibilities of the local government? And having in mind that we want these institutions to be very efficient in providing these services. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next.
Good morning. My question, I guess, is for Larry. What's your general idea about municipal land banking as a way to finance and control urban development?
Thank you.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Camilo Castellanos, director de planes parciales de la Secretaría Distrital de Planeación de Bogotá. Agradecer a los panelistas por compartir sus experiencias y conocimientos. Haría una pregunta muy concreta. Un aspecto al que le trabajaría desde la municipalidad para generar recursos para el desarrollo urbano y garantizar condiciones de equidad.
Gracias. Well, before you momentito, before you, the panel is listing the questions, and what we will do is when we have all these questions, I will invite the panel and they will answer selectively to the questions that fall within their interest. Okay? Please.
Buenos días. Mi pregunta es, ¿cómo lograr impacto y equidad con los esfuerzos, subsidios aplicados por el Gobierno Nacional si la cadena se rompe una vez los jóvenes, que son la fuerza de trabajo activa, terminan sus estudios universitarios, dado que no se tienen espacios y no se hacen esfuerzos ya en ese sentido? Porque ellos van a ser los padres de esos niños que vamos a tener que seguir subsidiando el resto de la vida. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Continúa. Next.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Luz Mariela Morales Caro. Bienvenidos a la ciudad de Medellín. Mi pregunta es para todos los panelistas, pero quisiera que me contestara el doctor Benjamín Avalos de la Municipalidad de Filipinas. Si para crear ciudades inteligentes se necesita hacer inversiones inteligentes. Una de las políticas públicas a nivel mundial es erradicar el hambre. Ustedes en sus municipios o en sus localidades, ¿cómo ha sido esa inversión y ustedes cómo han visto los resultados de esa inversión? Las personas, los niños, las mujeres, los hombres, sí han tenido un mejor comportamiento social, han tenido un mejor desarrollo psicomotor, han tenido una mejor concentración para responder a las necesidades básicas de todos los habitantes de sus localidades.
Gracias, gracias. Next.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Juan Esteban, estudiante de Planeación y Desarrollo del Colegio Mayor de Antioquia. Tengo dos preguntas. Primera, ¿cómo garantizar la inversión y generar confianza a los inversionistas cuando la deuda externa e interna no van en pro del mejoramiento de la calidad de vida de las comunidades más vulnerables? Y estas inversiones no responden a la realidad de las necesidades de estas comunidades. Segunda pregunta, ¿cómo hablar de equidad cuando las tierras están limitadas a las élites que tienen propiedades de más de 300 metros cuadrados y las comunidades vulnerables se encasillan en espacios cada vez más pequeños de 46, 50 metros cuadrados y no se garantiza el mejoramiento de la calidad de vida de estas personas? Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Me llamo Cecilia Guzmán Hoyos, vengo de la ciudad de Popayán, al sur de Colombia, y tengo una invitación y una pregunta. La invitación es que mañana empieza la Semana Santa en Popayán, la mejor de Latinoamérica, y todos están invitados. Y la pregunta es, aquí en todas las conferencias a las que he asistido, se ha tocado tangencialmente, pero no de manera concreta, el término del narcotráfico y la corrupción que nos afecta a todos los países en mayor o menor grado, pero que rompe estructuras, que rompe individuos, que rompe colectivos, incluso las finanzas con mayor razón. Entonces, a todos los panelistas ¿cuál es la acción concreta de este foro para atender este desafío tan grande, este mal tan grande para nuestros países? Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Next.
Buenos días, Adriana Orozco, gestora social de Madrid, Colombia, un municipio de Cundinamarca. Yo tengo una pregunta y una precisión. La pregunta es, de 1 a 10, desde el punto de vista de analizar financieramente a la ciudad, en el momento de planear la misma, cuando se llega a administrarla, ¿qué puesto debería ocupar esa actividad desde el 1 al 10? Y segundo, una precisión al doctor Walters. Nuestro municipio es un municipio de 120 kilómetros cuadrados, tenemos 7 kilómetros cuadrados de parte urbana, el resto es rural. 90% de la población está en la parte urbana. Nosotros, en un proceso desde hace 7 años, hemos venido trabajando lo de la plusvalía. Tenemos ya recaudados o mejor dicho, recibidos 5 millones de dólares. 1 millón ha sido recibido en efectivo, el resto ha sido obras, porque eso lo permite la forma de pago para el entorno de los proyectos urbanos, pero para el entorno urbano de la ciudad, porque mejora la ciudad. Entonces, ese $1 millón para el estrato pobre, que es el 60% de la población, que es estrato bajo o bajo, no nos ha ayudado en todos los problemas, pero sí nos ha servido bastante. Entonces, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
My question is for Major Avalos. I would like to know in which level was the public sector involved in structuring the project of the mall, and to all our guests, in which level should the public sector be involved? I mean, just identifying the needs and providing the legal and regulatory framework, or should it be involved in the financial process and follow-up of the project? Thanks.
Thank you. Next.
Good morning, my name is Juliana.
I'm very surprised because I haven't heard about social impact bonds in this panel, which I think are the most innovative financial mechanisms that is being explored. I work for Instiglio. We are by now the sole intermediary trying to bring social impact bonds to developing countries. We work here in Colombia and India. And I'd like to know the thoughts of Mr. Glasser, Muhanna, and Mr. Cohen in social impact bonds trying to address urban planning issues like waste management and water and sanitation. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Beatriz López de Mesa, represento el sector académico aquí en Medellín. Mi pregunta iría para el señor Alfredo Garay sobre todo y parto del siguiente supuesto. Creo que es más dignificante para los sectores pobres o vulnerables tener un ingreso digno que le permita satisfacer sus necesidades básicas y no tener que acceder al subsidio, que el subsidio genera más una mentalidad mendicante. ¿Cómo dinamizar entonces los ingresos de las familias más vulnerables apoyando empresas productivas de servicios y de producciones como alimentos, vestuario, calzado, vivienda, que dinamicen las microeconomías de los sectores subalternos y les permita acceder a ingresos dignos y de esa manera no tener que acceder a los subsidios?
Gracias.
Bonjour, je viens du Sénégal et ma question porte sur les financements innovants. Au Sénégal, notamment à Dakar, qui est la capitale du Sénégal, le principal financement innovant consiste à l'emprunt sur le marché financier. Je sais également au niveau de Colombie, notamment pour la ville de Medellin, le principal financement innovant porte sur les impôts sur les propriétés foncières. Donc, deux questions. La question principale est de savoir, y a-t-il d'autres types de financement innovants qu'on pourrait utiliser au niveau des communes, dans nos différentes villes. Et la seconde question concerne les prérequis nécessaires pour, en tout cas, réussir les mécanismes de financement innovants. Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Felicidades para todos y para todas. Soy Antonio Jesús García Franco de Medellín, Visión Planeta Azul. La inquietud básica es cuáles han sido los mecanismos o por qué no se ha tenido en cuenta las alternativas de la economía, llamémoslo así, alternativas como el concepto de la economía sólida, de la solidaridad, la economía del bien común, y el proceso de una renta básica que reemplace todos esos subsidios que hay en el mundo y que si van a ser sumados pueden ser mucho mayores que la posibilidad de un ingreso básico para la sociedad. Y son alternativas que ya se han experimentado en distintas partes del mundo. Entonces, bajo ese criterio, ¿qué se ha hecho para implementar dentro de este desarrollo urbano ese tipo de economías alternativas, del bien común, el de la solidaridad? Felicidades para todos.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Muy buenos días para todos y todas, para nuestros panelistas. Mi nombre es Rubio Olmos, yo soy economista, vengo del municipio de Dos Quebradas, departamento de Risaralda. Bueno, mi pregunta tiene que ver con el principio número 10 del Pacto Global, el cual tiene que ver con la corrupción. Entonces yo quisiera saber qué avances hay, porque la verdad que ese es el mal. O sea, los instrumentos financieros que estuvimos viendo, pues algunos de ellos son muy conocidos por mí, pero la verdad es que la plata se va por otro lado, por la corrupción. O sea, en este momento la corrupción contribuye enormemente a la iniquidad social. ¿Qué podemos hacer para romper esa cadena? Tenemos que romper con ella, porque la verdad que es muy triste. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Muy buenos días, mi nombre es José Franco y mi pregunta es la siguiente. En horas de alcanzar esa equidad social, ¿cómo hacer desde la institucionalidad, la planificación y el desarrollo territorial para mejorar las dinámicas de distribución del ingreso, trascendiendo las políticas subsidiarias y paternalistas? Y digamos que conectado con eso, ¿cómo evitar que los subsidios generen más problemas que soluciones?
Gracias.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Grace from Zambia.
The issue of equity, looking at a country like Zambia, which is a developing country, we have issues of investor confidence, and also it's a profit-driven investment. I would like to find out, we have very good performing telecoms. How do you bring them on board to ensure that the benefits that they are getting trickle down to the majority poor? Thank you.
Thank you. We've had 24 questions. Congratulations. You and I can clap. They have to answer the questions. So let me start by asking the mayor to start, and we'll go right along the panel. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mike. Probably what I'll do is I'll just answer those questions directed to me, considering that we do not have sufficient time here. The one question is which level of structuring of the mall is the involvement of the private sector. Well, excuse me. When we thought of the concept of the mall, it was something foreign in our country. So as far as that aspect of concern, it is 100% private as far as financing is concerned. So when we drafted the agreement, because what is important here, as was cited by Matt, is that the document that will be signed by both parties, government and the private sector, it must be strong so that it will stand even if I lose the election, it will be recognized by the successor. That is the first important thing. So from this, after this was implemented, the mall, it did not only give us enough money, but right now it was recognized by the national government. In fact, they have one sector in the Department of Trade which assists people as far as this is concerned. If you want, I could give you copies of these documents as far as the legal side is concerned. It has been well studied so that it could be a guideline for everyone. The second question was about creating intelligent cities, such as creating intelligent people and our programs for eradicating poverty, malnutrition, children, social performance, and psycho better ways. Well, as was presented, in our city it's from womb to tomb. Even if the child is still in the womb, we take care of the children by giving out some vitamins for the poor, so that when the babies come out, they come out healthy. And of course, education, etc., up to the time they die, you've seen our cemetery. But what is important here is that a month ago, we passed in our city what is known as the parental responsibility and parental neglect law. Because always they point to government, government, government. But how about parental control? When we pass this, it simply means that in our city, education is free. The books are free. You do not have to pay. But some parents who are of the poor, they do not allow their child to study. Sometimes they bring them to the streets to ask alms. So under our new law, those parents, once they know of this, they will go to jail. They will be given chance. No? Even vaccination is free. If they do not allow their child without justifiable reason to have them vaccination, they could be cited for this and they could be given community service. If they allow their child to smoke, if they allow their child to gamble, to join gangs, etc., this is the new law that we have had. So this, coupled with all other things that we have done, has really eradicated malnutrition. We see to it that we're very careful about nutrition because even data will show that 20 years ago there were no diabetes. Right now there are a lot of childhood diabetes. We monitor what children eat, even in school. You know? We make sure that there will be no soft drinks, the sugar regulated, etc. Because children right now, they have more time for computers, no? Unlike before during our time. So I know this will be a long more questions. I hope I have answered your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Matt?
So again, I'll just pick a few on which I think I have something useful to say. The question from the gentleman from Sierra Leone about what should be done by the state and what should be done by local government. You know, different countries vary on this. There was a period, maybe over most of the last decade, when there's been a sort of mania for decentralization, and I think we're starting to see that it's not always the solution for everything. But what I think is very important is that the revenue authority be matched with the expenditure responsibility. So it's no good saying to local government, you've got to provide services and make investments, and then not giving local government the necessary tax authority to do that. I think it's also unwise to separate the investment responsibility from the operating responsibility. So in many countries, there's a sort of theory that the national government will fund capital investment, and then the local authorities will operate and maintain the facilities. That leads, in many cases, to a real mismatch between the design and the operations, and tremendous inefficiencies. I think that the entity that's going to end up operating the thing is best placed to decide on the design. I know many years ago when I was a city attorney and the federal government was paying for sewer plants, we certainly over-designed the sewer plants. And when we had to start paying for them ourselves, we got a little more rational. There was a question about how can you achieve impact and equity if the youth have no jobs. You know, there's studies now for decades that show that persistent public investment in infrastructure like roads, like water, like electricity, and these days very much telecoms, and making those accessible all across all the segments of society correlates with economic growth. So you can't guarantee anything, but I can tell you if you don't invest in these things and make them available, there's no chance of economic growth. One of the people from Colombia mentioned that since the land tax came in here, there's been a lot of unfairness and people have lost property. You know, land tax mustn't be mindless either. In most countries that have strong land tax revenues, there are also provisions for poor people to get exemptions or deferrals, for old people to get exemptions and deferrals. It's one thing to say that people who don't have the current resources to pay tax must pay. That's not what anybody should insist on. But on the other hand, you can't excuse the wealthy from paying the fair cost of their use of the social asset of land on the basis that the poor can't afford land tax. You must subsidize the poor and tax the rich. One questioner asked about, on a scale of 1 to 10, how should the financial analytics be considered? And I would say finances, as Mayor Abelos said, is the lifeblood of a city. You can't say, shall we have blood or something else? You know, you have to have the finances and you have to get them right in order to deliver any kind of services. And in terms of the several questions about corruption, the best thing I have to say on that is transparency, 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 and an aggressively assertive public constituency demanding transparency and clean behavior.
If we do some trend analysis, our mayor answered 2 questions, Matt answers 5, I should go to 7, and then you are stuck with 14. So let me be brief in many of the questions that I'd like to give comfort to our Canadian participant that talked about accumulating of funds in a municipality not being used. I assure you, rating agencies penalizes municipalities that accumulate funds in excess of their development because they are not in the business of accumulating funds. They are in the business of collecting taxes and spending that taxes to the community. Of course, there are some reserving issues, but technically speaking, municipalities that do accumulate a lot of funds, they are penalized according to rating agencies. The colleague that asked about the effect about international banks on community, I'm not coming to the rescue of Matt here, but it looked like he read the book Economic Hitman. I assure you, that international banks do have a good side as well. But when there is bad, it means they have a counterparty in the local authority. So technically speaking, you cannot be corrupt without having somebody in the local authority misusing the international banks. Talking about state vis-a-vis local authorities, when do we do that? I think this is ideally when we feel that the local authority is mature to take the decisions. So technically speaking, the decentralization initially on administrative level, then on financial level, but this can only take place if there is an intention of investing in the management of the local authorities, then to give them the power to decide. Somebody talked about intelligent cities. Our mayor did mention, answered on that. I would like to expand one more sentence on that. Warren Buffett went one step very interesting when he talked about, here you are talking about intelligent cities and intelligent people. Warren Buffett said, intelligent people can only come from intelligent media. So if you want to really have intelligent people, work on your media, educate the media, so they can bring up not dogmatic issues, but rather proper issues to be discussed, so it will be handled properly in the cities. One of the participants asked about the social impact bonds. Yes, certainly this is something very typical, 20, 30, even maybe 40, but 20, 30-year bonds. That is a typical way to raise funds for infrastructure projects. Last but not least, innovative tax. When we think of tax, we only think of collecting more money. There are municipalities that de-tax, reduces tax, but against something else. And the typical thing is approving or initiating projects like rainwater harvesting. So there are many municipalities that lower the tax on residents that has a certain system on municipal on rainwater harvesting, but on the other hand, then the municipality is able to provide better water to the community and so on and so forth. So these are issues that I'd like to answer. Thank you very much.
Some really very interesting questions. It appears that our group was paying attention, so thank you. Let me see if I can address some that I think I may have something useful to say on. I want to go first to our first question about Moneyball for cities. It would seem to me that there are three things that have to happen, and I agree that in many instances there are legacy programs or other activities that have been undertaken by cities that are not necessarily as efficient, that don't necessarily meet the priorities of the community contemporarily. There are three criteria, it would seem, or three elements in the response to that sort of situation. The first is, as has been mentioned, transparency. It needs to be clear what the money is being spent on. And I like those cities that have adopted an approach that says we're going to prioritize our spending by program, and we're going to show not only where we get the money, but what we spend it on and what we accomplish with it. That's the kind of transparency that I think is called for in municipal finance. Second, though, that implies that there is the administrative capacity in the city to do that kind of evaluation, and it doesn't always exist. It needs to be built. The third element that will address this issue is public participation. The public needs to be engaged in setting the fiscal priorities for the city and the investment priorities. And if you do those things, if you have transparency, if you build the administrative capacity, if you encourage public participation and meaningful participation in the process, I think that the issues that you very correctly raised can be identified. The question of what happens if we are successful in increasing land values, how do we reconcile that with making sure that the lowest income, most vulnerable populations still have access to land. This is a very difficult issue. I've been looking at a project that UN Habitat is proposing here in Medellin, and one of the that is a land readjustment project that is intended to take housing, much of which is informal, regularize it, readjust the land boundaries, and increase the densities, increase the land value in the process. And a very logical question is, well, if we do that, how will the people who live there now be able to afford to live there? Especially when you link that with the kind of subsidies that I mentioned earlier, that the utility rates for the lowest income strata are subsidized. If we raise that, the quality of housing so that it's no longer in those bottom strata, then do their utility rates go up, and that makes it even less affordable for them. The answer in addressing that is to make sure that in the process of the redevelopment, we're working with the developers to earmark a certain portion of the housing so that it's not sold at market level. It's the people who live in those locations should be able to continue to live there. Now that means that we may have to increase densities in other ways. We may have to increase the proportion of commercial development in order to be able to make that financially feasible for the developers. But clearly it's an issue that we have to attend to in the process. Yes, we want to improve living conditions, but we don't want to displace people who are living there now because they won't be able to afford the new development. On the issue of state versus local responsibilities, very important question. And I think here the issue of subsidiarity, which is a principle that the UN Habitat supports, is an important one. We need to identify the level of government and the agency within government that has the capacity to carry out a given task. And now some of the tasks, such as the property tax, may involve several different processes, such as recording developing and managing the cadastre, valuing the property, delivering the tax notices, all of these various elements to it. That doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be done by the same agency or at the same level of government. In most of Colombia, for example, valuation is done by a national entity. Medellin is the exception. Bogota and Cali, I think, also does their own. But for the rest of the country, it's done by a national agency. And then the tax is actually assessed at a local level. But in other countries, it may be possible to contract for the delivery of tax bills or contract with private entities for the collection of the tax. So we have to identify who has the capacity to carry out whatever the function is that we're interested in having delivered effectively, and then assign that function to the entity with the greatest capacity. The issue of land banking, I think that's a very interesting possibility in those societies in which private ownership is recognized, which is not all societies by any means. Land banking, having a community land bank that actually owns the land and having the people then have access to build housing or on the land without actually purchasing the land, is one way that we can keep the costs down for while still improving the quality of housing. I'm not sure that we should exempt that land bank from all property tax, however, because again, the people that live there do pose a burden on municipal services. There is increasing value in that land, and it should be used efficiently. We don't want to create a situation in which we create a legacy system which will be difficult or impossible to change in the future, even though it may be desirable to change it. So I think it's an interesting possibility. Depending on the context, it has to be designed very carefully. One of the first World Urban Forums that I went to was in Barcelona. And in that session, I went to a session there in which the president of the International Slum Dwellers Association from Mumbai spoke. Very articulate man who made some very important points, I thought, about the need for public participation in designing public investment. He talked about building public toilets in slums in Mumbai, and how if the local community was not involved in the design and the construction, they got trashed within days. They were just destroyed. But when they involved the local participant, the local community in the location, the design, the operation of those facilities, they added significant value to the community. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of public participation, especially from the populations that are most vulnerable in our communities. We need to get them involved in identifying and designing, identifying needs and designing the response to those needs. The issue of land being limited to the elite, and how do we achieve equity when that's the case? That's a very important issue. As has been noted, it is often the case that when you try to reform or make modifications to a system that taxes land, or that the people who own the land are also the ones that are politically powerful and resist those changes. I recognize that that is a political reality, but I think the answer to this issue of how do we address the problem of land being limited to the elite is tax the land heavily, not the buildings. The buildings represent private investment, and that's important for the community, but tax the land heavily. And some communities have attempted to actually raise the tax rate depending upon how much land is owned. In Namibia, for example, they put it in place a tax based on the number of farms that you own. The first farm is taxed at one rate, the second farm at a higher rate, the third farm at a higher rate. In principle, that sounds like a great idea as a way of increasing the cost of large landowners. But again, recognize the administrative implications of doing that. Not only do we have to know who owns this farm, we have to know how many other farms this landowner owns. Administratively complex, very complex. So we have to tax the land heavily, and I think the easiest way to do that is to tax land and buildings differently, but tax the land much more heavily than you do the buildings. How much public involvement should there be? Public can play a role in facilitating, in bringing together the actors, as we saw in the Philippine example. Much of what they did was to facilitate, say, here's a site, let's get the people together who can make it happen. There is also an opportunity to provide seed capital. Maybe some infrastructure needs to be invested initially to put in roads or improve sewage systems or power systems, things of that sort. That's been done in China. There's also an opportunity to share risk. Now that has to be done with great care, because the private sector would be just overjoyed to have the public sector assume all of the risk and let them take all of the profits. That's not what we want that's not what we mean by a public-private partnership. Okay. So there is some opportunity to share in the risk, but you need to make sure that the public isn't assuming all of the risk. And I think with that I'll stop. Thank you.
La primera cuestión tiene que ver con la pregunta del amigo de Toronto. Una vez a mí me había interesado cómo es que Guatemala tenía un aeropuerto tan moderno, tan notable, y tuve oportunidad de hablar con el ministro de Economía, y él me dijo que había financiado la construcción del aeropuerto generando un fideicomiso donde depositaba toda la subejecución del presupuesto del Estado, ¿no? Esto me llevaba a una primera constatación interesante, o sea, cuánto es lo que no se gasta, digamos, ¿no? Es decir, pero por otro lado, también me llevaba a desconfiar, digamos, del manejo del ministro de Economía o en los municipios de los secretarios de Hacienda cuando tienen la llave de la válvula que administra la ejecución del gasto, ¿no? Y creo que ahí hay una cuestión importante, o sea, porque una cosa es el presupuesto aprobado y otro el desembolso concreto que finalmente tiene un manejo político, es decir, que habilita a determinado sector y obstruye a otro, digamos, dentro de la dinámica cotidiana de ejecución del gasto. Volviendo sobre las cifras también, hay, digamos, un dato que me pareció interesante. Cuando damos créditos en Procrear, digamos, a familias que se van a construir una casa, le damos más o menos entre 40 y 50 mil dólares y ellos con eso construyen una casa. Pero cuando le preguntamos a las empresas constructoras en una licitación la construcción de un conjunto de 40 casas, dice que con esa cantidad de dinero no les alcanza. Entonces, bueno, yo creo que esto nos lleva a dos observaciones. Una, que parecería que esa afirmación reniega de todo lo que serían las economías de escala, el fordismo, ¿no? Es decir, los planteos del movimiento moderno respecto a la tecnificación de la construcción. Pero por otro lado también nos alerta respecto de una segunda cuestión que tiene que ver con cómo se articula el empleo formal y el informal en la producción, por ejemplo, o en la ejecución, digamos, de esa inversión, ¿no? Seguramente a una familia que le damos un crédito para hacerse una casa, contratará unos constructores locales, no agremiados, digamos que trataremos de inspeccionar que paguen las cargas sociales, pero objetivamente abaratan el proceso constructivo mucho en cuanto ellos administran su propia obra. En cambio, las empresas constructoras, y sobre todo las grandes, asumen, digamos, como negocio la administración del contrato y subcontratan a mecanismos informales, digamos, en general, la realización de las obras. O sea, hay ahí un mecanismo de acumulación, digamos, que se naturaliza en el proceso licitatorio, pero que nos habla, digamos, de una cierta ineficacia de una manera de ejercer el gasto. Ahora, creo que este ejemplo nos sirve también para entrar en una segunda cuestión de las que se planteó en varias preguntas y que me parece central, que es el tema del salario, ¿no? Porque nosotros nos hemos acostumbrado en estos últimos años a ir desplazando la problemática de las condiciones de vida, de la lucha salarial, a la reproducción en la vida barrial, es decir, el ámbito donde se mueven los informales, los desempleados, los que no tienen una adscripción a un trabajo formal y disputan su salario en ese trabajo formal. Podemos decir que en el contexto de la globalización también los países de bajo salario, en general, digamos, pasamos a ser competitivos sobre una caída tendencial del salario. Y esa caída tendencial del salario es directamente proporcional a la caída de los modos de vida en nuestras sociedades. Es decir, esa cuestión, digamos, de cómo se discute el salario, cuál es el componente del salario como salario directo y cuál es la proporción de salario indirecto, digamos, de jubilación, cargas sociales, medicina, crédito para la vivienda, etcétera, que formaba parte de las luchas gremiales tradicionales. Bueno, hoy esto poco a poco se ha ido desdibujando, lo cual nos habla de un cierto debilitamiento del sistema gremial, de las formas de representación gremial, como parte de la problemática urbana. En este punto yo creo que es importante mantener algunos indicadores, digamos, que nos van a marcar el estado, digamos, de nuestras sociedades. Uno es el nivel de empleo, ¿no? Es decir, las sociedades que se aproximan al pleno empleo tienen mayores salarios y en general se experimenta un notable mejoramiento de las condiciones de vida de la población. Y esto repercute en acceso a tierra en el mercado, se convierten en sujetos de crédito. Todo lo que no pasa cuando el empleo se vuelve empleo informal, cuando el porcentaje de desempleo supera un dígito y digamos que es gran parte de la realidad de nuestras sociedades. Yo creo que en este punto la afirmación del salario y, digamos, la discusión del salario como parte de la equidad social, digamos, tiene que volver a ocupar un lugar destacado y yo creo que en esto, digamos, hay una asignatura pendiente. He escuchado poco este debate en estos días, digamos, en el marco del foro. Y esto, digamos, creo que nos habilita una tercera cuestión, que yo creo que es importante, que tiene que ver con los fenómenos de corrupción. Yo, digamos, lo que vengo viendo, digamos, en nuestras realidades, que tienen índices de corrupción bastante altos, significativamente altos, veo dos tipos de patrones de comportamiento. Por un lado, dirigentes que abdican del ejercicio del poder del Estado por identificación, digamos, ideológico, social, con los intereses dominantes. Y en general no se piensa que son personas corruptas, pero objetivamente ponen el Estado en función, digamos, de un sector social que en general no coincide, digamos, con los que tienen mayores demandas. Y hay otra segunda modalidad, otro segundo patrón de comportamiento, que son aquellos dirigentes que venden su poder político, como diría en algún momento, por un plato de lentejas. Es decir, en realidad, como dice un escritor de mi país, la corrupción es el poder de los ricos. ¿Por qué? Porque son los únicos que pueden pagar la corrupción. Y por lo tanto, vuelve a poner al servicio de los intereses privilegiados, digamos un poder político que muchas veces conquistaron con el sufrimiento de los sectores subordinados. Yo creo que no hay otra manera de combatir la corrupción que no es el intercambio, el equilibrio de poderes, o sea, el mecanismo, digamos, el establecimiento de mecanismos sofisticados de representación social que supongan controles mutuos y formas directas de control social. Es decir, una obra de construcción donde los beneficiados desde el primer día pueden ir siguiendo la obra, es una obra que va a tener muchos menos vicios ocultos que una obra que cuando está terminada se le asigna a los beneficiados. Es decir, todas estas formas organizativas que participan, digamos, del funcionamiento del Estado son la mayor garantía de transparencia. Bueno, quiero terminar agradeciendo mucho a Hábitat y agradeciendo mucho al coordinador del panel habernos invitado a tener esta posibilidad de discutir, y quiero agradecerle a la ciudad de Medellín y a ustedes, digamos, haber podido sostener durante un tiempo tan prolongado un panel tan lleno de ideas y tan interesante. Michael, gracias.
Thank you very much. I think I'm not going to try to summarize what we have just experienced. I think there have been a lot of wonderful comments, lots of interesting information, excellent questions, and I would agree and support Freddie Garai's last comment and thanking everybody for your participation. And I'd like to thank the panel. I think everybody was just great, and there were terrific comments, and it was a lot of fun. I think we had a good time. I think it was interesting, and I think we learned something. So I'd really like to thank you for your great job. Two things. One, as you came into the room, you were given a form for evaluation, and I'd appreciate if people could fill out that form, because the Habitat is evaluating the whole process, and I think that would be useful input to making these even better. And I'd like to end with just one comment. As you know, in a couple of years there will be a Habitat 3. There will be an important conference in which many of these issues will occur. I think that what we saw today was a very rich discussion. So when I think about Habitat 3, I would like to think about Habitat 3 as a process and not as an event. I would like to see many more discussions like this occur in many spaces around the world, because I think we need to have more debate and more discussion, maybe not flying so far in order to arrive at one place. We have to find new ways of doing things, to come up with new ideas, and I think the best way is to have as many people as involved as possible. So I'd like to thank all of you. I'd also like to very much thank Gulat Kebede and Ananda Wikiwita from Habitat, who helped organize this and got us here. And I'd just like to thank you. There's a saying in Swahili that those who have arrived have a long way to go. Thank you.